Chapter 730. I'll do it. Dake took the teacup, picked up the teapot, and began to pour tea for everyone present. Professor Shi Erfu nodded slightly and sat back in his seat. Tonight's incident was still within expectations. Of course, there were also some unexpected things. Regarding these incidents that happened within the academy, the professors had always preferred to resolve them within the academy. In principle, the Shang Malian Academy did not belong to any country. It had its own discretion and did not need to be responsible to any country. It was just that the academy's anchor point was set at the border of the kingdom, and it had a lot of cooperation with the kingdom, so there would occasionally be compromises. However, if something like this happened too often, it would obviously have a negative impact on the academy's reputation. Therefore, they would do whatever they could. Like today's incident, if one didn't delve into the implications, there were actually only 2 victims on the surface. It was still uncertain whether White Gouda was a victim or not. Professor Shi Erfu was very rigorous when judging this kind of thing. Remember the website, Vipkanshu. 6. Although Werther God showed that he didn't know about the second consciousness in that duel, Lucian didn't know anything about it. However, this did not rule out some kind of acting. Before the official investigation, it was impossible to determine what role he played in this incident. It's a pity that Ka Zayer is not here. Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but rub his eyebrows. For this type of investigation, Professor Ka Zayer's mind-reading ability was very important. Unfortunately, Professor Ka Zayer's mind was no longer on this matter. Compared to the matter he was focused on, the current incident was just a small matter. However, there were still substitutes. Professor Shi Erfu looked up at Dake Dimming, who was pouring tea, and there was a hint of relief in his eyes. The atmosphere was still a little dull. Even though Dake poured a cup of tea for everyone, it didn't ease the tension. In the end, he sat down beside Eve and asked her a few questions in a low voice. He then learned that Eve had been sent here by Yvette. Eve and Ollie. Eve was the one in charge this time, and Ollie was just accompanying her. But as the wind-enchanted field closed, the connection between Eve and Erin was also severed. She could only report to Arvet later. Of course, since Professor Shi Erfu had allowed them to follow him, it meant that he had tacitly approved of her leaking the information. In fact, if this matter was as bad as she thought, perhaps she would need the help of the kingdom. Doc had already guessed Professor Sylph's intentions after learning about Eve's visit. On this occasion, the one who shouldn't be sitting here the most was Hephaestus. However, since he was already here, it would not be good to chase him away. After all, Hephaestus was already half a professor and could be considered one of them. Dake poured himself a cup of black tea and took a whiff of its aroma. His gaze then turned to the White Gouda, who was sitting alone on a chair. White Gouda, who had just experienced a huge defeat in his life, was shaking his left leg nervously. Perhaps he hadn't connected the whole story to this incident, but he more or less sensed that he had fallen into a bad situation. The first thing he thought of was Luo Boat's experience. Then, he guessed that he might have been possessed by a vampire. But after he left, he flipped through the card deck and card pack and discovered that he had never seen them before. Yet, they were inexplicably familiar and frightening. With the sudden isolation of the second consciousness, the existence of these magic cards could no longer be hidden. White knew that Luo Boat had obtained several magic cards after the vampire possession incident. However, the magic cards in Luo Boat's possession were on a completely different level compared to the dozens of magic cards in his hands. The more he looked, the more frightened he became. He vaguely felt an unknown fear shrouding his entire body. Before he could figure it out, Professor Shi Erfu appeared before him. He had become the target of scrutiny. Among the people present, there were 3 who knew nothing about this incident. However, Professor Shi Erfu obviously didn't intend to explain it to them. When the black tea in the cup was 1 centimeter below the edge of the cup, Professor Shi Erfu finally spoke, "Dake, get ready." She didn't say it explicitly, but Dake already understood. "In the name of Dake Dimeng, I summon the fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye." Dake silently chanted the summon. The beautiful goddess who covered her third eye with her bangs materialized beside him. The fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, was actually celebrating with the pink rabbits before this. They didn't leave the duel hall and were ready to watch another duel. However, it adjusted its state quickly. In the blink of an eye, it had already sat down beside Dake, looking very meticulous. The situation here was very clear. The fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, knew what its mission was as soon as it sat down. Dake didn't say anything. She had already looked at White Gouda, who was sitting in the prisoner's seat. White Gouda suddenly felt a sharp gaze on his cheeks. He quickly looked at the eyes of the fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, but all he saw was as clear as water and as cold as ice. White. Professor Shi Erfu's voice made him look away. He was a little nervous as he replied, "Professor." Professor Shi Erfu said sternly, "Do you know why you're sitting here?" White Gouda pressed his hands on his knees and slowly grasped his trousers. He then said in a low voice, "I don't know." Professor Shi Erfu glanced at the right hand of the fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, and suddenly said sternly, "I thought you were at least an honest child." White Gouda's body trembled. He subconsciously looked at Ophelia Bullard, who was sitting on the sofa, with a pleading gaze. However, the Bloodbell's face was even more serious than Professor Shi Erfu's. She didn't give him any response. White suddenly felt that he might have unconsciously made an unforgivable mistake. The nervousness in his heart became heavier and heavier. Gulp. He couldn't help but swallow his saliva and said, Could it be that I'm also possessed by something?" The fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, formed an O with her right index finger and thumb, indicating that White wasn't lying. Professor Shi Erfu sighed slightly and said, "Then what do you think about being possessed by something?" Victor thought hard and carefully gave 2 examples. Vampires? Brain fluid demon? Professor Shi Erfu asked, "You know about the brain fluid demon?" White nodded and said, "I think I know a little. Vern Morse was possessed by the brain fluid demon. Could it be that I did it?" White suddenly exclaimed halfway through his sentence. Then he found that the whole room was quiet. Professor Shi Erfu still had a straight face. Dake and his magic elf looked indifferent. Professor Midya's smile seemed to be wider. Sister Carl Yen didn't do much. Ophelia's face became gloomier. As for the other 3 people, he didn't know why they were here. White's observation skills were actually very strong. He quickly noticed a terrifying fact from the reactions of all parties. What happened to Vern Morse was most likely his doing. Then the reason why the Academy started the investigation that day was also because of me? Brain fluid demon. Demon creature. Magic card. Angus Jeffrey. Victor recalled the magic cards in his card bag, and once again captured an even more frightening fact. Then, the matter with Angus Jeffrey, could it be that I was the one who did it? Although Angus Jeffrey's case wasn't made public, the students had a lot of guesses. In addition, he had left the academy for many days, so the rumors naturally spread. Many people had already equated what happened to Angus Jeffrey with what happened to Vern Morse, which was why Victor asked this question. However, Professor Shi Erfu shook his head and said, "You did it. You can't escape. If you didn't do it, you can't bear the responsibility. Cooperate well. Answer whatever I ask." White couldn't help but look at Ophelia Bradley again. This time, Ophelia finally reacted and nodded slightly at him. White felt a little relieved, but he still answered Professor Shi Erfu's question nervously. This was an extremely long and arduous investigation. Professor Shi Erfu's questions covered the entire semester. She questioned Victor in detail based on the timeline she got from Vern Morse and Angus Jeffrey. In particular, she focused on the incident at night. Now, with the experience provided by Angus Jeffrey and the confirmation that White Gouda had a second consciousness, Professor Shi Erfu's questions had an obvious logical line. During the questioning and answering, White Gouda's face became more and more unsightly. He finally knew why he would feel tired when he woke up early in the morning. There were even special times when he would feel dizzy and unsteady. That was a sign of excessive blood loss. White Gouda always added his own blood to the magic refining process. He treated this as a secret that was different from others. Of course, he couldn't draw a tube of blood every day. At most, he would drip a drop each time. But sometimes, he would feel that he was not in good spirits. Now, during the questioning, he finally understood the reason. It turned out that he always woke up in the middle of the night, sneaked into the secret passage, and cultivated demons with Angus Jeffrey for experiments. During the busy night after night, Angus Jeffrey's spirit gradually became haggard. His physical condition gradually deteriorated, and the dark circles under his eyes became deeper and deeper. But he probably spent less time in the secret passage at night, and his physical condition was obviously better than Angus Jeffrey's, so the dark circles under his eyes weren't as deep, and his appearance didn't look too abnormal. Of course, the abnormality of excessive blood loss was difficult to subside. But perhaps it was because of his body's instinct. He subconsciously ate some food that replenished blood. He didn't like to eat that kind of food. Blood? After listening to the whole investigation, Dake pondered for a while and suddenly had an idea. After a while, he thought to himself, no wonder Angus Jeffrey could successfully cultivate a demon body using Into the Abyss as a reference, but I couldn't. Is it because I lack blood? Of course, the blood in this couldn't be any random blood. Dake knew very well that White's blood was special. Now that the Demon King's blood in Ophelia Bradd's body had been removed, he was probably the only human with the Demon King's blood. The Demon King obtained almost all the characteristics and abilities of the demons by creating vessels. In a more scientific way, it is a walking gene bank. So, if the Demon King escapes, it can recreate an entire demon race. White's bloodline is considered the second generation of the Demon King's blood. The purity of the blood is definitely not comparable to that of a normal vessel. The blood of a hero, the blood of a Demon King, and the two sides of light and darkness at the same time. This does seem like a characteristic that a protagonist should have. Dake continued to listen while thinking carefully. White's blood contains almost all the genes of the demons. It's probably necessary to cultivate the demons. Into the Abyss didn't mention this. Without the Demon King's blood, even if the knowledge in Into the Abyss is printed into a book, it won't be of much use. So, the value of that book is very limited. I can't ask for a drop or two of his blood every time I want to cultivate some demon body parts. Sigh. Then, who wrote that book? Could it be that White's second consciousness wrote it himself? As more and more information flowed into his mind, Dake's train of thought was gradually completed. He finally had a general understanding of everything that had happened. Then, he realized another problem. This problem was related to his premonition and conjecture all this time. First of all, he thought that White's second consciousness was likely to have a great origin, just like the Dark Game. The easiest candidate was undoubtedly the Demon King. Professor Shi Erfu might have thought of this too, but she didn't directly point it out. Instead, she continued to beat around the bush to prove it. However, without awakening the second consciousness, this evidence was actually rather weak. However, the so-called solving the case turned out to be based on a bold assumption. Bold assumptions, careful verification. If White's second consciousness was the Demon King, then it involved a question. When was his second consciousness born? It couldn't have been after school started. The most correct judgment would be last Christmas. Because the devil died on Christmas Day last year. In other words, last Christmas, when they were still guessing where the Demon King would be and how he would be revived, the Demon King had actually quietly revived in White Gouda's body. Come to think of it, this was really a terrifying feeling. If the Demon King didn't become retarded, White's consciousness would probably be invaded on the spot. No, in the original game, this might be a bad ending. And there must be a way to solve this problem. Therefore, although White became the Demon King's vessel, he wouldn't be invaded by the Demon King's consciousness. The subsequent plot was likely to revolve around his entanglement with the Demon King's consciousness. Of course, the Demon King wouldn't tell White that he was the Demon King. The struggle, concealment, and battle of wits must be quite interesting. However, based on the overall plot framework, the Demon King's consciousness should only be a part of his soul. The Demon King must have another main consciousness. Otherwise, as the protagonist, Who would White destroy in the end? Thinking of this, Dake suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He hypothesized a way that White destroyed the Demon King in the original game. If he instigated the Demon King's soul, could he use that soul as the foundation to swallow the Demon King's main soul? In this way, the Demon King wouldn't die again. If he didn't die, of course, he couldn't be revived. Dake's thoughts were getting more and more open. He intuitively felt that he had figured out the complete plot of the original game. According to the final plot framework, the things that happened in the school today were most likely because of his arrival. White definitely didn't have the means to deal with the Demon King's consciousness at this time. And unlike the original game, the Demon King's consciousness in his mind should be complete, just a little retarded. If the Demon King's consciousness didn't become retarded after the Christmas incident last year, he might be dead now. As for the means that White used to resist the Demon King's consciousness in the original game, Dake already had an idea. It's the God of Underworld. The moment he figured this out, Dake suddenly had a feeling of enlightenment in his heart. Then, he felt the pleasure of sorting out the truth from the messy clues. He really wanted to reach out to the mirror and say, "There's only one truth, you're the murderer." Of course, the above inference was only a bold guess at the moment, and it still needed to be carefully verified. But this time, it would be a bit difficult to trick White's second consciousness out. But if the above inference was correct, White was about to encounter the biggest trouble in history. Even if the Demon King's consciousness lost its memory and became retarded to some extent, it was still the Demon King. If this fact was exposed, how could the Shang-Malian Academy protect him? Or, would he choose to protect him? That wasn't right. The Academy could also choose to extract the second consciousness out of his body. But White's situation was definitely different from Angus Jeffrey's. If the Academy wanted to extract the second consciousness out of his body, they would probably have to do an experiment of soul-cutting. The second consciousness wasn't just a consciousness, it was a second soul. Based on the degree of integration of the two, the experiment of soul-cutting was very likely to cause some irreparable damage to him. "Show me your card bag," Professor Shi Erfu said to White. 3 hours of sleep, went up the mountain to deliver a lamp, and connected a tale. Today is really meaningful. Wow, please vote. Chapter 731. Magic cards were the lifeblood of a sorcerer and would not be easily shown to others. However, White had no right to refuse under such circumstances. He took a deep breath, took off the card bag, and handed it to Professor Sylph. Professor Shi Erfu felt the weight in his hand and realized that there were more than 40 magic cards in his card pack. White took tonight's duel very seriously and even saw it as a milestone in his life. Of course, winning was a milestone, and losing was just a threshold. His second consciousness was influenced by him and made some small moves. When he adjusted the card pack, he added some magic cards that White did not know about. Naturally, there were not only magic cards like Demon General Habakkuk, Vampire Viscount, Blood Devil Sandra, and Blacktail's Blood. If White could adjust his mentality in time and continue the duel with Dake after his second consciousness had shut himself off, he would have had a chance. Professor Shi Erfu immediately opened White's card pack and took out all the magic cards at once. Sister Kalyan, who was beside him, immediately moved the tea set away from the tea table. She put all the magic cards on the table and looked through them one by one. The first website was https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP. Since there was no cover, everyone's eyes were focused on her. Dake was also very curious about what other magic cards White had. He stopped thinking and looked carefully. Vampire, vampire, vampire. After a while, everyone had a general understanding of the magic cards in the card pack. Unlike Angus Jeffrey's mixed army, most of the cards in White Gouda's card pack were related to vampire. Of course, there were other magic cards related to the Devil Clan, but that was not the main point. Professor Shi Erfu took his card pack and wanted to check if there were any magic cards like Demon King, a muster. However, after looking through all the magic cards, she did not find the Demon King. In this card pack, the magic card with the highest star level was a 9-star Vampire Marquis, Vampire Constantine. A 9-star magic fairy was not a big deal in the eyes of everyone present. However, if they followed Dake's deduction, they would find that this was actually a very scary thing. If the second consciousness was the resurrected Demon King, then it would have been resurrected in White Gouda's body last Christmas. Until now, it was still unknown how retarded it was, but its memory was definitely incomplete. Perhaps White's memory was still the dominant one. However, it seemed that the learning ability of the second consciousness was terrifying. From last year's Christmas to this year, in less than a year's time, the second consciousness had already refined a 9-star magic card through learning. Just this ability and talent alone made him worthy of being the most difficult Demon King to deal with in history. Fortunately, it was discovered in time. If it was given more time to learn, it would definitely become a huge threat. With the rapid development of magic technology, more and more sorcerers could no longer control their footsteps. Disaster had already sprouted. Even if there was no revival of the gods, unrestricted magic technology would bring about decline. After Professor Shi Erfu finished looking at all the magic cards, he put them away and turned to ask, "Are there any more?" White shook his head and said, "Maybe there are, but I don't know. When the time comes, go to your room and check." Professor Shi Erfu said seriously, "Come here and divide these magic cards into 2 portions. One for you, and the other for it." White moved over and quickly picked through the cards on the table. After he divided the magic cards on the table into 2 piles, Professor Shi Erfu put the pile of magic cards that he had refined into the card pack and handed it to him. "Take this. As for this one, I'll keep it for now." Of course, White would not have any objections. He quickly took the half-empty card pack and tied it to the side of his leg. Under Professor Shi Erfu's instructions, he sat back in his chair. Professor Shi Erfu stacked the remaining magic cards into a pile. When he was sorting them out, he took out a magic card called a glitter bug and sighed slightly. The appearance of the glitter bug more or less confirmed Dake's guess. He was almost certain that White Gouda was the third one. She put the neatly stacked magic cards on the table and let go. Then back to the main topic. "Can you find a way to summon the other one in your body?" White Gouda said awkwardly, "I don't know, Professor." Professor Shi Erfu crossed his fingers and said softly, "Try it. You didn't know of its existence before, so you didn't try. But from the current signs, it is very clear about your situation. Obviously, there should be a path between you and it. This path can't be one way." White Gouda was silent for a moment and said, "Then I'll try." Professor Shi Erfu nodded slightly and didn't say anything else. White took a deep breath again, then closed his eyes and began to summon the second consciousness in his heart. At this time, he didn't know the possible identity of the second consciousness. Professor Shi Erfu didn't mention the word Demon King during the whole night of questioning and maintained a relatively peaceful attitude. If the second consciousness could use White Gouda's senses as a window to observe the outside world, then it should only be able to feel the right vigilance. That was a normal precaution against the unknown, and not some radical act of extermination. In a situation where the existence of the second consciousness was completely exposed, there was room for communication between the 2 sides. Of course, all of this was based on the premise that the second consciousness had lost the memory of being the Demon King. Now that he thought about it, that was very likely. And its brain was more or less a little abnormal. So anything was possible. Professor Shi Erfu and Dake quietly looked at each other. On the other hand, Doc nodded imperceptibly. The current situation was actually better than expected. The most important point was the existence of Ophelia Bullard. Ophelia Bullard was White Gouda's mother. Her existence was extremely confusing and would make the second consciousness instinctively have the impression that they wouldn't do anything to it. This impression was very important. It was the basis of luring it out. And once it was lured out so easily, then what happened next would be out of its control. It didn't know that Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Heart, wasn't a lie detector, but a monster that could see through people's hearts. Sometimes, it would selectively reveal some secrets and make people lose their vigilance. Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Heart's little trick was also a trap. Time slowly passed. Professor Mitya and Sister Karlien began to whisper to each other. Eve's expression was serious as she wrote and drew in the notebook she brought with her. Ophelia Bullard began to drink tea frequently. Everyone was waiting. And White Gouda himself, after trying to call out, immediately came into contact with the second consciousness. This was a development that White himself didn't expect at all. Just as he was about to open his eyes, the second consciousness hurriedly stopped him. The corners of his eyes twitched violently. Then he began to communicate with the second consciousness in his heart. I was born because of you. You and I are one. The second consciousness opened its mouth and said. Of course, White Gouda wouldn't be fooled by these two simple sentences. He immediately asked, Who are you? The second consciousness turned and said, Do you know about multiple personality disorder? I'm the second personality that was born after you experienced too many setbacks. I represent your will to pursue strength and the embodiment of your personality that wants to defeat everything. Its voice was gentle. It wasn't as cold and sharp as it had been on the duel field. White Gouda's brows furrowed slightly. This time, he was a little moved. Really? After a short silence, the second consciousness said, As I said, you are me, and I am you. I know everything that you know. White Gouda immediately pursued, But I don't know the things that you know. The second consciousness explained, That's because I am the observer, and you are the executor. Once you and I switch places and I take control of the body, you can see what I do from the observer's point of view. Just like in that duel. White Gouda carefully recalled and found that he really did remember the scene of the duel between the second consciousness and Dake. He couldn't help but be surprised. Then why didn't I know when you secretly refined the magic card? The second consciousness said without hesitation, That's because you were sleeping. White. Logic closed loop. But in reality, White had already been guided and interfered with by the second consciousness during this exchange of consciousnesses. He focused all his attention on this actually crude logic closed loop and subconsciously ignored the loophole that should have been obvious at a glance. When the second consciousness added the magic card to his deck, he wasn't asleep. But there was a hierarchy between the two consciousnesses from the beginning. White didn't have any ability on the spiritual level, but the second consciousness had mastered several or even dozens of special abilities. The second consciousness wanted to trick him. It was as simple as using a lollipop to trick a 2-year-old to look at a goldfish. It didn't take long for White to believe that the second consciousness was his second personality. He then asked a very important question. Since you and I are of the same origin, why do you know how to refine those magic creatures when I don't know at all? The second consciousness already had an answer. Because of Into the Abyss. Into the Abyss. White was shocked and immediately thought of the book he got from the library when he was in first grade. Although he didn't know where the book called Into the Abyss was now hidden, the taboo love that came from it was still in his card pack, constantly helping him to win. What about that book? He couldn't help but ask. But the second consciousness said, It's not that book, it's another one. I sneaked into the library late at night and picked up another, Into the Abyss. White. The second consciousness said, In that Into the Abyss book, there was a detailed description of part of the cultivation method of the magic creatures. I relied on the method described in it to cultivate a large number of magic creatures' organs, and then used it as a foundation to refine them. After countless attempts, I finally refined those magic cards you saw. White. Those magic cards. Are the magic creatures' organs so easy to cultivate? No. The second consciousness shook its head. They are not easy to cultivate. Even if there is a method, it requires a lot of resources to support it, and that's not enough. I used Cameron Macefield for an experiment and finally came to a conclusion. That book was missing a key piece of information. It wasn't until Angus Jeffrey appeared that I suddenly figured it out. Well, actually, I was lucky. When I was doing the experiment with him, I accidentally dripped 2 drops of blood that I brought with me. That experiment was very successful. Blood. White Gouda said in surprise. The second consciousness asked in a matter-of-fact tone, Don't you know? You have the blood of the Demon King. This plain sentence was like a bolt from the blue, suddenly splitting White's brain open. He couldn't maintain his facial expression, and he clenched his teeth hard. Since the beginning of his first grade, he had been using his own blood as a catalyst for refining magic cards, and had achieved a lot of success. However, that was because he was the hero's son. He felt that the blood of the hero's son flowed in his veins. That was why he could increase the success rate of the magic card crafting and improve the quality of the magic card, and he could enjoy the benefits with peace of mind. But today, when the second consciousness suddenly pointed it out, he suddenly realized that he had been using the blood of the Demon King to refine magic fairies. White Gouda certainly wasn't the kind of person to believe what others said, especially when it came to this kind of thing. But in fact, the second consciousness's words were not untraceable. He knew that his mother had been embraced by the Demon King before, and was a blood relative of the Demon King, but he didn't think much about it. Now that it was suddenly pointed out, it made him feel like a dusty truth was suddenly revealed, and he subconsciously believed it. The fact that the second consciousness was willing to reveal such a dangerous secret made him trust the second consciousness even more. If before, he still had doubts about the second consciousness's identity, now he almost completely believed it. Seeing that he didn't respond, the second consciousness continued, "The inheritance of the bloodline isn't something we can decide, but we can use it effectively. There are devils and dark-type magic fairies among them, but they have the blood of the Demon King. We're not the Demon King." "That's right. We're not the Demon King." White Gouda suddenly woke up, but he said subconsciously, "But what you're doing isn't good." Fern Moores and Angus Jeffrey. The second consciousness immediately said, "I'm the embodiment of your personality that wants to conquer everything. In order to become stronger, I'll do anything." From a certain moment, White Gouda's facial expression became very rich. While Dake and the others were waiting, they all realized that he had already made contact with the second consciousness. "It's good to have contact, but I'm afraid there's no contact." Dake picked up the teacup and took a sip, then suddenly realized that the tea was cold, so he boiled another pot of tea and poured it for the others. The rich aroma of the black tea gradually spread in the office along with the steam. White Gouda finally opened his eyes when he drank half a cup of the new tea. Dake glanced at his eyes and knew that this was not the second consciousness. Then, Professor Shi Erfu said seriously, "Did you succeed?" White Gouda nodded and said, "I can call it out." Professor Shi Erfu asked, "Do you know what it is?" White Gouda took a deep breath and said, "It's my second personality. I'm sorry that I didn't notice its existence before. I'll take responsibility for my mistakes." Professor Shi Erfu said, "It's good that you have this awareness. How's its attitude?" White Gouda said, "It's very peaceful and reasonable. If you want to ask, I can temporarily give it control of this body." "Okay," Professor Shi Erfu responded and said, "Then call it out." "Okay." White Gouda closed his eyes again. This time, only a few seconds later, he opened his eyes again. His dark pupils spread out slightly, and the proportion of white in his eyes became less than normal. This change was actually not obvious, but both Dake and Professor Shi Erfu had already noticed it. The second consciousness finally appeared again after it closed itself off. Everyone paused for a moment at this moment. Then, they stopped what they were doing and looked at White Gouda. Hephaestus Doragon's expression was still filled with curiosity. Ophelia Bullard's eyes had already become sharp. Professor Shi Erfu and Dake's expressions did not change much. After the second consciousness opened its eyes, it did not do anything out of the ordinary. Instead, it carefully observed everyone present. Professor Shi Erfu looked at Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Mind's Eye, and the latter used its index finger and thumb to form an O shape. Professor Shi Erfu said, "How should I address you?" The second consciousness frowned and said, "Professor Shi Erfu, I'm white." Professor Shi Erfu smiled and said, "Yes, I know. You have a second personality." Her stern face suddenly melted like ice, and a bright smile blossomed on her face. This change was so sudden that no one could react at all. This second consciousness did not completely deceive White. At least, when White controlled the body, it could observe the outside world freely as an observer. But whether it was when it was first born, the memories copied from White's brain, or the memories that continued to accumulate after that, it had never seen Sarah Shi-Erfu smile so brightly. So, after a very short stupor, a sharp pain suddenly pierced through its mind. It had an extremely ominous premonition. Almost an instant later, the second consciousness reacted. The pupils in its eyes shrank abruptly. It was clear that it wanted to escape. But in the next second, its face showed an inconceivable shock, and then a murderous look overflowed from the corners of its eyes. The pitch-black magic shot out like an electric current, and it suddenly exploded and pounced on the stack of magic cards on the table. "Huh!" Professor Shi-Erfu just reached out and tapped lightly, and a strong wind suddenly blew in the office. The paper documents on the desk rustled, and White Gouda's bangs were blown up. The wind that turned into a rope suddenly contracted and tied its body tightly. It was in midair, but it could no longer move. At that time, apart from the second consciousness, quite a few people also looked surprised. Dake was also surprised, but when he turned his gaze, he found that Sister Ka-Lien had already revealed a smile, and Professor Midia had a card up her sleeve. It was clear that Professor Shi-Erfu's actions weren't sudden, but had been premeditated all along. The only people who knew about her plan should be Sister Ka-Lien and Professor Midia. "Hey, can I come in now?" Lily Laplace poked her head out from the ceiling. Dake's eyebrows twitched. Well, they were probably worried that Professor Lily wouldn't be able to keep her cool, so they had assigned her the task of standing guard outside. Looking at the second consciousness, it was tied up in midair by Professor Shi-Erfu and couldn't resist. The only thing it could reach was the White Gouda's card bag. But it hadn't chosen to use the White Gouda's magic cards in the beginning to fight, and it was already too late to make a choice now. Half a minute later, it seemed to have finally realized that it couldn't escape. It gradually calmed down, and its face was filled with confusion. "Why? What why?" Professor Shi-Erfu asked slowly. "Why did I catch you? Why can't you escape? Or is it because I don't believe that you're White's second personality?" The second consciousness's face was ashen. It braced itself and said, "Even if you don't believe it, it's the truth. I know that I made mistakes because of my radicalism, but that was just to win. I want to become stronger. I want to become stronger than Dake. I want to defeat him. I want to cross the threshold. I have to do that. Well, I know I'm wrong. I'll change, Professor." Seeing that Professor Shi-Erfu was completely unmoved, it struggled and suddenly turned its head to look at Ophelia Brad, the bloody maiden, and cried sadly, "Mom." But from Ophelia Brad's eyes, there was only murderous intent. The pupils of the second consciousness suddenly shrank. It knew that there was no way it could escape. It immediately stopped acting. Its face was cold, but the magic in its body was crazily surging out under its control, trying to break through the shackles of the wind lock. But Professor Shi-Erfu had already picked out a magic card and quickly recited the words in his mind. 3 seconds later, 3 long transparent needles emerged from the card's surface. Then, under her control, they flew out and nailed itself between its eyebrows, its heart, and its dantian. After that, the 3 long needles were connected by rays of light, forming a triangle. The second consciousness suddenly realized that it could no longer mobilize the magic in its body. Its 4 limbs were bound, and its magic was sealed. It couldn't turn around at all. Bang! White Gouda's body was thrown back onto the chair. The second consciousness desperately opened its eyes. It hadn't completely given up. Even though its 4 limbs were bound and its magic was sealed, it still had a mouth. It could speak, and it could use its words to fight for a chance to survive. But all of this happened too suddenly. It still hadn't fully reacted. It couldn't even understand why Professor Shi-Erfu would treat it like this. Just as Dake had deduced, it didn't actually know what its identity was. It was just a pitiful, brainless little thing. "Professor Shi-Erfu, can you tell us now?" After a moment of silence, Ophelia Brad was the first to ask. She must be desperate to know everything that she could. But Professor Shi-Erfu shook his head and said, "There's no hurry. Let's ask Dake's magic fairy first." But when she looked at illusionary beast, goddess of the mind's eye, Dake asked curiously, "Can you first tell us how you fixed its consciousness?" "Let me tell you." Sister Kalyen smiled and said, "After all, I performed a consciousness extraction operation on Angus Jeffrey with Professor Ka Zaire. I finally gained some experience. Although White Gouda's second consciousness is very similar to Angus Jeffrey's second consciousness, it's actually not completely the same. Body, soul, consciousness. Angus Jeffrey's second consciousness is just a second consciousness. It's attached to the same soul as Angus Jeffrey's main consciousness. But White Gouda is different. His soul is also split." "What's going on?" Ophelia Brad suddenly asked anxiously. Sister Kalyen glanced at her and said, "It's not exactly split. In his current state, it's possible that the two souls are fused together and then cut in half. Let's use an analogy." As she spoke, she picked up 2 pieces of white paper from the table and stacked them together. She said, "White Gouda's current state of soul is like these 2 pieces of paper. When they are stacked together, they turn from 2 to 1, and then, with a little force, she slowly tore the 2 pieces of white paper apart from the middle, leaving only a little connection. Just like this," she said, "his soul is divided into 2 parts like this. Then, there are 2 consciousnesses attached to one part of the 2. This explanation was simple and easy to understand. Even Dake immediately understood. But it would have been better if she didn't say it. Now that she said it, Ophelia Brad completely understood. She couldn't help but murmur, "If they are so deeply integrated, how can they be separated?" "There will always be a way." Sister Kalyen looked indifferent. But if one looked closely, they would find that there was excitement hidden in the depths of her eyes. "A new white mouse," Sister Kalyen continued. "After coming to this conclusion, it means that as long as its soul is fixed, it can't escape. Consciousnesses are intangible, but souls are tangible. Unless it can break free from the shackles of the soul and continue to live as pure ideology. But obviously, it can't do that. That is the patent of the gods." She said it casually, but even if it was just fixing the soul, it wasn't something that ordinary people could do. Moreover, her method was untraceable. Even the bystanders couldn't see her move. For someone with this kind of ability, what did she do to be kicked out by the Holy Church? Dake thought in a daze. After that, he didn't ask any more questions. If he asked too much, he was afraid that the second consciousness would find a way to break free. He turned to Magical Beast, Goddess of the Heart's Eye, and said, "Next, tell me everything you saw." Magical Beast, Goddess of the Heart's Eye, calmly told him everything it saw from beginning to end. From the moment it was summoned, White Gouda's mental activity didn't escape its insight. And from the moment the second consciousness took the initiative to come into contact with White Gouda, the communication between them also didn't escape its insight. In other words, the second consciousness's spiritual conversation with White Gouda, as well as its thoughts at that time, had already been exposed. Phantasmal Beast, Goddess of the Heart's Eye, then told him everything that happened, no matter how big or small. As the second consciousness listened, sweat appeared on its forehead. It looked at Magical Beast, Goddess of the Heart's Eye, with blazing flames in its eyes. After a period of time, everyone present, including Eve, Olga, and Hephaestus, had a more specific understanding of the situation. The conversation between the second consciousness and White Gouda was a mixture of truth and falsehood. It was indeed easy to bait people. However, its inner thoughts at that time had completely exposed itself. It had indeed been born after Christmas last year. The timing was completely consistent with Dake's inference. When it had just been born, it had been blank. Including its memories, there was nothing. What helped it gain knowledge was White's memories. It had copied White's memories and gained the most basic knowledge. It was also influenced by White's thoughts and became what it called a personality that wants to defeat everything. Of course, it didn't have multiple personalities. It was just like Dark Game, a body of consciousness with its own soul. However, its way of thinking was ultimately different from White's. It used the perspective of an observer to absorb all the information that White could come into contact with. However, it gradually developed a completely different understanding from White's. It thought 24 hours a day and easily sensed a lot of information that White didn't. For example, the fact that White had the blood of the Demon King flowing in her body. Not long after it realized this, the second consciousness suddenly found some memories that it didn't have before in its mind. Those were memories of part of the demon race's cultivation method. In the beginning, there were only a few memories, so they did not attract its attention. However, as time passed and the memories gradually increased, it realized that something was happening. Later, it understood. It really did understand. Not only did it understand where those memories came from, but it also understood why it was born. Those memories were brought by the blood of the Demon King. It was born to become the Demon King and revive the demon race. To be honest, it couldn't be blamed. After all, the information that the second consciousness could obtain was extremely limited. Ophelia Bullard didn't tell White about the Demon King's vessel, so the second consciousness naturally didn't know. It didn't think that the Demon King could be resurrected in White's body after death. It also didn't think that it was the Demon King that it wanted to become. At this time, Dake had more or less confirmed its guess. However, the conclusions derived from this were both good and bad. First of all, the Demon King did resurrect in White Gowda's body after death. Second, the Demon King completely lost its memories after resurrecting. Yes, it was a little retarded. Finally, the Demon King's memory loss wasn't permanent. It could recover. This last conclusion was very troublesome. Although it didn't know if it was related to the blood of the Demon King, the second consciousness did recover part of its memories. With that part of its memories, it used the book Demon's Skin to write the book, Into the Abyss. The reason for this name was naturally because White once had a book called Into the Abyss. It really liked that sentence, walk into the abyss, stare into the abyss. Then, considering that White didn't have the conditions to experiment, it found Cameron Macefield and tempted him to breed demons. After Cameron Macefield's failed breeding, it made some improvements to Into the Abyss, and then found Angus Jeffrey. At this time, Into the Abyss could already interfere with the mind and cause the holder to have a second consciousness. Their first experiment wasn't carried out in the secret tunnel. Later on, due to some coincidences, they found the correct breeding method and bred the first demon, the brain fluid demon. After that, in order to verify their ideas, they bred the second brain fluid demon, step by step. After the brain fluid demon was bred, considering the need for secrecy in the experiment, the second consciousness guided Angus Jeffrey to breed the organs of the glitter worm, and finally refined it into a card, not using the basic refining method, but a directional refining method. As the research deepened, the second consciousness found that its memories were still increasing, but it was all knowledge about the demon creatures. This knowledge provided it with the basic conditions for directional refining. Of course, the leader of the experiment was still Angus Jeffrey. It didn't use the directional refining ability alone. However, relying on Angus Jeffrey, the second consciousness was able to refine quite a few high-star magic elven cards. As for Angus Jeffrey's Demon King Emu, it was actually very envious. However, it was personally refined by Angus Jeffrey, so it couldn't steal it. The whole process wasn't very complicated. With the fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's straightforward description, Dake and the others quickly sorted out their thoughts. In fact, the number of people involved in this incident was very small. Cameron Macefield was one, but he was basically just a bystander. Angus Jeffrey was another, but he wasn't just a victim. Vern Moores was another, and he was the only complete victim. As for White Gowda, now it seemed that he couldn't be considered the perpetrator, but he also couldn't be considered the victim. To say that he was the perpetrator, he didn't do anything. To say that he was the victim, he was the beneficiary. If it weren't for the existence of the second consciousness, he wouldn't have been able to win the Silver Cup championship. But in that case, Saraswati was more of a victim. In short, this was a muddled account that was difficult to sort out. Considering that this matter couldn't be made public, it was impossible to return the Silver Cup championship to Sarah. From the point of view of the professors, they could only give her some credits as compensation. As for White, after knowing that he didn't rely on his own ability to win the Silver Cup championship, he probably even wanted to die. "You guys, what are you going to do with me?" The second consciousness didn't know that the magical beast, goddess of the heart's eye, had the ability to read minds. It had some confidence in its mental abilities, but it did not expect that it would be completely exposed without even the slightest bit of awareness. But at this point, it had no other choice but to admit defeat. After that, Professor Shi Erfu's answer didn't leave any room for negotiation. Cut it off. In short, it had to be cut off from the white Gouda first. This was the biggest prerequisite. As for whether to destroy or seal it, they would have to consider it later. But considering that the Demon King could be resurrected after death, the professors would most likely choose to seal it. "If there's no good way to cut the soul, I can try," Dake suddenly interjected. Since the essence of the second consciousness was actually the soul, then the coffin of the dead was an expert in this area. However, after being eaten by the coffin of the dead, the Demon King would still be resurrected in other containers, so it could only be considered a last resort. They discussed how to deal with the second consciousness one by one, causing it to feel a chill down its spine. It wished it could just die on the spot. It still didn't know that it was very likely to be the Demon King. Everyone present was very cautious, and no one revealed this information to it. Finally, it couldn't take it anymore and wanted to curse, but the wind threads around its mouth suddenly increased and blocked its mouth in a timely manner. Woo-woo. It could only desperately make sounds. Professor Shi Erfu resisted the urge to cut it into 3 pieces and said, "It's almost Christmas, and Cynthia should be back. Let her decide then. If there's no other way, just kill it." Woo-woo-woo. It could only be said that the second consciousness's desire to live was very strong. Dake glanced at it and said, "If you can successfully cut it, you can consider refining it into a magical fairy." Woo-woo, woo-woo. Its cries became more and more shrill. "Fantasy beast, goddess of the heart's eye," suddenly said, "it said refining it into a living thing is taboo." Professor Shi Erfu said, "Under normal circumstances, a living thing will die in the process of being refined into a magical fairy." Dake smiled and was about to say something when Fantasy Beast, goddess of the heart's eye, suddenly said, "It said that it has a very important piece of information, and it wants to exchange it for its life." Dake was stunned, and then he slowly looked at Fantasy Beast, goddess of the heart's eye. Fantasy Beast, goddess of the heart's eye, directly said, "It said that it can feel that far away, there's a comrade who bears the same fate, and it can help us find it." The second consciousness. Woo-woo, woo-woo, woo-woo. "When I woke up, I dropped another place on the monthly votes list," she cried as soon as she wailed. Chapter 732. A Comrade Who Bears the Same Fate? Dake and Professor Shi Erfu quickly exchanged glances, their expressions unchanged. At this time, they were basically certain that this second consciousness was the reincarnation of the Demon King. They did not think that this second consciousness had any comrade who bears the same fate. But what if it really did? With a gentle wave of her finger, Professor Sylph unraveled the wind seal on the second consciousness. As soon as the second consciousness could speak, it immediately begged, "Trust me." It really bent at the first turn. Dake sighed. He did not expect the Demon King to have such a personality. However, from its experience of being beaten by the pink furry rabbit until it became autistic, he could more or less see that the Demon King at this time was not an unusually tenacious character. However, he did not expect the Demon King to take the initiative to betray its comrade in order to survive. Who is the comrade it is talking about? Dake could not help but think. Is it the remnants of the demons who have the same ambition and wish to revive the demons? Or is it a hidden demon general? Or is it the surviving son of the Demon King? It can still feel the presence of that comrade in the academy, so it should have a close relationship, right? Maybe it's a critical container. Remember the URL. Vipkanshu. 6. While he was thinking about this, Professor Shi Erfu asked directly 3 questions. Think about it before you answer them. Who is it? Where is it? How did you sense it? What is the connection between the two of you? As soon as these 3 questions were asked, the second consciousness immediately knew that it had a chance of survival. It quickly said, I will tell you everything I know, but you have to promise to spare my life. This request was a bit too much. Professor Shi Erfu suddenly felt a little troubled, but she quickly changed her mind and said, How about half of your life? The second consciousness. Okay. Professor Shi Erfu could not help but let out a small cry of surprise. She was just joking, but she didn't expect her second consciousness to agree so quickly. As if it was afraid that Professor Shi Erfu would change his mind, it immediately told him everything it knew. It was during the holidays. When I was observing the white experiment, I suddenly felt a warmth rising in the distance. It made me feel that I was not alone. Aren't you White's second personality? Dake interrupted. The second consciousness turned around and said in slight embarrassment, That's different. In fact, at that time, the second consciousness wasn't sure what it was. In the beginning, he did think that he was a split personality of the White Gouda. However, later on, he discovered that he had a complete personality, and the White Gouda was not missing anything. Thus, the hypothesis of a split personality was not valid. As he gradually recovered his memory of the demon breeding method, he felt that he might be the Demon King's backup plan, a special descendant born from the Demon King's blood. Although it was very strange that a descendant of the Demon King was born from the hero's body, the stranger it was, the easier it was to accept. After all, it was special. From this perspective, the second consciousness was indeed a split of White's memories. Both of them had the same subconscious, and they had a very clear understanding of their own uniqueness. Ever since White knew that he was the hero's son, he had always felt that he was special, and thus had extraordinary requirements for himself. He thought of using his own blood to refine a magic fairy for the same reason. It was the same for the second consciousness. Because of its uniqueness, it had high expectations for itself and had always pursued its so-called mission. Because of this, it was exposed. Originally, it had been hiding and secretly shooting guns. After 8 to 10 years, it would have become an archmage of the 10-mile slope or something. Who knew how far it could go? However, it was unwilling to be left alone and jumped out. Wasn't it caught? Sigh, this sounded like something White would do. As expected of a product born from White's memories. The second consciousness continued. Anyway, that warmth gradually became clearer after that. I could feel that it was very similar to me. It was like we were twins, advancing and retreating together. We must have the same mission in life. As for who it was, I don't know. Every time the sun rose, my perception of it would be very strong, but when the sun set, that feeling would quickly die down. As for where it was, I don't know. I only know that it was in the west, very far away from me. Then, it saw Professor Shi Erfu immediately turn to look at Fantasy Beast, goddess of the mind's eye, after hearing this, and said urgently, I know she can see through my thoughts. I'm not lying. There's no way she would do anything under your nose. Fantasy Beast, goddess of the mind's eye, said slowly, she thought that even if she told you about that comrade's existence, you wouldn't be able to find her. That's why she wanted to exchange for her life. The second consciousness. Facing an existence that could read one's thoughts, no one would be able to remain calm. However, although the second consciousness's thoughts were stupid, there was a logic to them. This made it more or less lose some of its moral integrity. Although it wouldn't improve everyone's impression of it, they wouldn't think that it was a complete piece of trash. Of course, this wasn't a good thing. Dake pondered for a moment and said, Is there anything else you want to say? The second consciousness turned around and said, I've already told you everything I know. You promised me. Dake shook his head. Hey, I didn't promise you anything. The second consciousness immediately turned to Professor Shi Erfu and said anxiously, But it promised me. Professor Shi Erfu gave it a kind smile. Dake said, Your information is so vague that it's difficult for us to do anything. Do you remember when you sensed your comrade's time? Which day was it during the holidays? Don't say that you forgot. No one will believe you. The second consciousness. 15th of July. 15th of July? Dake immediately became alert and looked at Professor Shi Erfu. Professor Shi Erfu looked at him almost at the same time. The two of them looked at each other and were slightly shocked. Dake immediately asked, "Then when you first sensed her, where was she?" The second consciousness. South. The second consciousness had a special ability on the mental level. It could control its own thoughts and prevent itself from thinking about things that it shouldn't think about. However, if Dake asked, it would have to answer. When it said this, Fantasy Beast, goddess of the mind's eye, could tell whether it was true or not. It first sensed her comrade's aura on the 15th of July. At that time, her comrade was in the south. The Shang Malian Academy was now located in the north of the kingdom. The south was the direction of the royal capital. On the 15th of July, the Holy Church held the Demon King execution ceremony in St. Louis Square in the royal capital. At that time, although Dake wasn't present, he saw everything through the telepathy spell between Evelyn and Evelyn from a distance. He had a very deep impression of the Demon King execution ceremony. Professor Shi Erfu directly attacked the Demon King execution ceremony at the scene. There were a few people present who had seen it as well. A lot of things happened during the Demon King execution ceremony. Excluding the minor details, the Holy Church had used the ritual of witch hunt and great prophecy during the Demon King execution ritual to refine the Demon King's corpse in reverse, causing a new soul to be born in the empty shell of the corpse. However, no one knew what the condition of the soul was. After the new soul was born, the Holy Church used the lock of light to bind it, burned it with the holy fire, and clamped it with the rules of the ritual. In the end, they summoned the door to the underworld, the door frame. Using the door frame of the door to the underworld as bait, the Holy Church put on a big show and killed many remnants of the demon race. At that time, the witches' hunt ritual was still going smoothly. The new Demon King's soul was still being burned by the fire. The Holy Church gave people the feeling that they were going to send the Demon King's soul into the underworld. However, in reality, the Demon King's soul was created on the spot. The door to the underworld wasn't really opened. Dake, Shi Erfu, and the others saw through these arrangements at that time. However, they still didn't know what the Holy Church was planning. They wanted to wait and see what would happen. However, after that, an accident happened. A small butterfly flew to the door to the underworld and used her antennae to poke a very small hole in the door to the underworld. Then, the underworld and the real world were truly connected at that moment. The new Demon King's soul was really sucked into the underworld in an instant. Countless fire of the underworld drilled out at that moment. Some of them attached themselves to many people who were present at that time, while some drifted far away and drilled into more people's bodies. Even though the chief archbishop, Caleb Norris, repaired the hole at the fastest speed, everything was out of control. It was too late. No matter what the Holy Church's original plan was, it was impossible to implement it. However, if the second consciousness felt the comrade's aura that day, because there was only one of them, it wasn't likely to be the remnants of the demon race who were present at that time. In fact, Dake and the others were more or less sure that the second consciousness was the Demon King reincarnated after Easter's death. Then, the so-called comrade could only be the new Demon King's remnant soul. The Holy Church has a strong foundation. Dake couldn't help but think so in his heart after he sorted out his thoughts. Although he saw through many things at that time, he always felt that the new soul, refined by the Holy Church, was just a fake with a huge flaw. It might not be too different from the Demon King's soul, but it probably didn't have the ability to reincarnate. It didn't have the Demon King's unsolvable immortality. However, at this moment, the words of the second consciousness seemed to be telling him that the new Demon King's soul also had the ability to reincarnate. Moreover, even the death of being sucked away by the door to the underworld didn't make it truly die. When the new Demon King's soul was sucked away by the door to the underworld, the connection between reality and the underworld was personally made by the Archbishop. To the present world, it was dead. Then, naturally, it was resurrected. In other words, the new Demon King's soul was resurrected. And it was resurrected in the West. This was a very simple logical deduction. However, superficial deduction was different from in-depth investigation. This was because the truth was indeed a little shocking. From the south to the west, how did it go over? Dake asked. The second consciousness frowned slightly and said, It jumped over, right? Maybe it was teleportation, or something else. In short, it was just a moment. At first, I almost thought that it was two people, but it must have some kind of method. Dake asked again, how long was it from the south to the west? The second consciousness slowly said, a little bit of time? A few seconds, a few dozen seconds. I didn't pay much attention to it, so my memory is a little fuzzy. Dake, during that period of time, did it completely disappear? The second consciousness said, maybe it was during the teleportation process, so I couldn't form a sense of it. This isn't something that requires too much attention. After saying this, it suddenly realized something and asked subconsciously, do you know who it is? Dake raised his head and smiled. Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. A devil king who didn't know he was a devil king was naturally easier to deal with than a devil king who knew he was a devil king. Dake and the professors had already reached a tacit agreement to hide this truth from him. The second consciousness saw that he didn't intend to answer, so it could only bury its fear in its heart. It said, from the looks of it, my comrade should have a very high status, so my information is very valuable. You can't go back on your words. Moreover, although I can only sense his general direction, if I get closer, I might be able to sense his precise location. If you want to find him, you must need me. Being able to turn into a radar was its greatest reliance. In its heart, it actually had another idea, but it deliberately suppressed its thoughts and didn't let itself think in that direction. It didn't completely trust these humans in front of it. Even if they were the type who kept their promises in the White Gouda's memory, it couldn't bet its life on their kindness. Being able to sense the comrade's direction was the follow-up value it could derive from deliberately revealing this information. It needed this value to ensure its survival. After that, as long as it could successfully find that comrade, it still had a chance to live. It had placed its last hope on that comrade. Although the second consciousness didn't reveal this idea, with Dake and the others' intelligence, they would naturally figure it out when the time came. This wasn't actually a secret idea, it could even be said to be an open conspiracy. Moreover, its idea was destined to succeed. It didn't know this. Once Dake and Professor Shi Erfu could confirm that its so-called information was about a new devil king, they would probably be more anxious to find that comrade than the second consciousness. Reality had changed too quickly. In less than a year, the second consciousness had transformed from a blank slate into a powerful archmage who could create a 9-star magic guide fairy. This was a warning to Professor Shi Erfu and the others. Finding that comrade as soon as possible was something they had to do after Headmaster Erti returned. The reason why they didn't do it immediately wasn't because Christmas was around the corner. Of course, school affairs weren't as important as finding the new Devil King as soon as possible. However, there was something more important during Christmas. Everything had an order, and that was all. In front of God, the Devil King who hadn't reached God's realm could only be pushed back. In the end, Professor Shi Erfu asked the second consciousness, "Is there anything else you want to say?" The second consciousness was silent for a long time, but it still shook its head. Professor Shi Erfu took out a magic guide card and silently recited an incantation. Just as the first consciousness was feeling nervous, a wave of drowsiness suddenly surged over it. It quickly disintegrated its resistance, causing it to fall into a deep sleep. Professor Shi Erfu waved his hand again, and the wind threads binding it suddenly increased. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a huge cocoon, completely sealing it from head to toe. Next, it's time for the meeting. Professor Shi Erfu waved his hand and said to everyone. The interrogation of White Gouda ended temporarily. Professor Li flapped his wings and flew to Dake's side. He squeezed in between Eve and Dake, and then he happily swung his little legs. Dake moved to the edge of the sofa and leaned over to pour tea for her. After Professor Shi Erfu announced the start of the meeting, Ophelia Bradley was the first to speak. Professor Shi Erfu, are we really going to keep it alive? Professor Shi Erfu didn't expect her to ask this question first. He was a little surprised. I thought you would ask about White's situation first. However, Ophelia Bradley just shook her head and said, "There's nothing to ask. It's very clear what White did and didn't do. He and the demon. Well, the Demon King's soul is now partially merged. However, there's Professor Stephen Harvey in the academy. I believe in his ability." Professor Stephen Harvey was the 6th grade professor of Introduction to Magic half a year ago. Now, he didn't teach the main course. Instead, he chose to take an elective course called Medicine, and was in a state of half-rest. His other identity was one of the few remaining necromancers. After Ophelia Bradley was refined into a magic card by Dake, Professor Stephen Harvey personally separated her soul from the Vampire's Daughter magic card and glued it back to her body. It could be said that Professor Stephen Harvey was another one of Ophelia Bullard's saviors. Dake's beginner, soul loss spell, was also improved by Professor Stephen Harvey. It was normal for Ophelia Bradley to have this kind of trust in Professor Stephen Harvey. However, Professor Shi Erfu shook his head and said, "This time, I'm afraid even Professor Stephen Harvey will find it difficult to handle. However, we'll definitely do our best." Wait. At this time, Hephaestus Doragon, who had been watching the show, finally asked his doubts. "You're saying that thing is the Demon King?" It was quite obvious that Olga and Eve's eyes were focused on Professor Shi Erfu's face. They were waiting for his answer. Professor Shi Erfu sighed and said something meaningful. "It's not the Demon King. The one in the west is the Demon King." Professor Shi Erfu quickly realized that before this meeting, it was obvious that he should tell the few participants the cause of the incident. Therefore, he didn't want to waste time talking about it, so he gave this difficult task to Dake Dimming. The lowly little Dake had no right to refuse at this time. He could only waste his time talking about what happened last Easter. The story was actually very complicated and strange, and it was mixed with many things that ordinary people couldn't understand. Olga and Eve knew a little about it, but it was the first time Hephaestus heard about it. It was also the first time she knew that the secret tunnel in Shangmalian Academy was so special. Later on, when they heard that Ophelia was refined into a magical fairy by Dake, they couldn't help but look at Ophelia with a strange expression. Cough. Even someone like Fresh Blood Concubine, who was as soft as tofu, couldn't help but cough hard. When Hephaestus heard that Professor Stephen Harvey glued her soul back to her corpse, she suddenly said, "So, our class Victoria is your—" "Hey, is she your sister or your daughter?" Ophelia said awkwardly, "Victoria. Is that the vampire girl's name?" She knew about Victoria's existence and even secretly looked at her. However, because she was still under house arrest, she didn't have any actual contact with Victoria. Hephaestus sighed again. "Why? She's from the same origin as you, so why didn't she inherit any of your good points?" Cough cough, let's not digress. Dake decisively interrupted her and continued to talk about the Demon King's current situation. Not long after, Hephaestus, Olga, and Eve finally understood the whole situation, and then the three of them fell silent. Although Doc had downplayed the entire incident, it was as if the sky had collapsed if one were to examine it carefully. If it was someone else, they would probably yell at them, "Hey, that's the Demon King, the Demon King." But in short, this incident didn't just involve the Demon King. It also involved the heroes, the saint, and the school. To the saint, whether it was Blood Bell Ophelia Blood or the new Demon King in the West, they were all top secrets that couldn't be told to outsiders. To the school, although the professors didn't mean to, they still personally caused the death and revival of the Demon King's body. This was also a top secret that couldn't be revealed. Even Doc was closely involved in this matter. Although he played a good role in it, it would be hard to explain if he really pointed it out. The saint would definitely include him in their calculations to shift the blame. Because whether it was Blood Bell Ophelia Blood or the other small characters involved, they weren't enough to go against the saint. In the end, they couldn't take the blame. Only by involving the Shangmalian Academy and the Valkyrie faction could the world know that this wasn't the saint's fault. Our saint sect has no choice. But speaking of which, if it was only the Easter incident, the saint had to bear the responsibility of not being able to defend the prison. First, it was unfavorable to the defense of Badia prison, causing Bloodbell, who had been embraced by the Demon King, to escape from the prison. They couldn't catch her in time. Second, it was unfavorable to the defense of the Demon King, and they couldn't stop Bloodbell from killing him. But after that, the saint held the Demon King execution ceremony. That was just to roast oneself on a fire. It was lucky that one wasn't burned to death. So in the end, the best way was to keep it a secret. As long as the saint and the school reached a tacit agreement, this secret could still be kept. Once the secret was leaked, the consequences would be unpredictable. But what if the secret was really leaked? Then on the school side, they had to deny the Easter incident, deny that the second consciousness of the White Gouda was the Demon King, and let everyone know that the Demon King in the West was the real one. It was the saint who didn't do well in the Demon King execution ceremony, and let the Demon King escape. Choosing the lesser of two evils was also applicable to the saint sect. In the current environment, what the people couldn't stand the most was not the Demon King escaping, but being deceived. Once it was exposed that the Demon King execution ceremony was deceptive, the saint would really start to collapse. As for the Demon King that escaped, he would be caught sooner or later. Even if some people blamed the saint for letting the Demon King escape, as long as they kept the secret and caught the Demon King as soon as possible, it wasn't impossible for the saint to clear their name. Even after they caught the Demon King, most of the people would forget the mistakes they made in the past. So, can I ask that question now? Ophelia asked the question that she had been holding back for a long time. Professor Shi Erfu, do you really want to leave the Demon King half alive? Professor Shi Erfu turned his head and said calmly, "What do you think about how to deal with it?" Ophelia immediately said fiercely, "I want to drink its blood and eat its flesh." Hephaestus whispered in her ear, "The only things you can drink and eat now are your son's blood and flesh." Ophelia was speechless. She was obviously very well-mannered, which was why Hephaestus was spared. Little Li with pointy ears puffed up his cheeks like a bun, but he still deflated in the end. Dake also wanted to laugh, but he was obviously very well-mannered, so he successfully held it in. Professor Shi Erfu didn't change the topic because of this. He said with a straight face, "Blood can be drunk, meat can be eaten, but people can't be killed." Since they already knew that the Demon King's memories could be recovered, they couldn't let it escape no matter what. It took so much effort to walk into the trap. How can we let it escape? Dake shook his head. Then Ophelia looked at Dake and said, "Refine it into a magic guide fairy." Dake repeated what Professor Shi Erfu said. Under normal circumstances, a living creature will die in the process of being refined into a magic guide fairy. Ophelia immediately frowned and said with a bitter expression, "You can do it, right?" The refinement of a magic guide was a very meticulous process. Even if the steps of the basic experiment seemed simple, the internal reaction was extremely complicated. The so-called simplicity was built on the complexity of the refinement formation itself. Thus, during the refinement process, no matter what creature's soul or consciousness was, it would be erased by the extremely complicated reaction process. It would be fine if it didn't succeed, but if it did, it meant that the creature had died. But on the night of Easter, there was a person who broke common sense and made the impossible possible. Dake added bliss into the refinement that night, and successfully protected Ophelia Blood's soul and consciousness. However, when faced with Ophelia's almost pleading gaze, Dake still said rationally, "Auntie, it's not that I don't want to help, it's that I can't. Using the souls of living creatures as materials to refine a magic guide is not a field that I can dabble in. The success last time was built on the foundation of the entire ritual. I only provided a little help and changed the direction of the ritual. After a while," he said, "maybe I'll be able to do it after I master the method of refining the ritual." Ophelia immediately said respectfully, "That should be fast, right? You're so smart. White is always praising you in front of me." "Huh." Dake still smiled. "Auntie, you're so clumsy when you flatter me." Ophelia's face immediately turned red. "You child." "All right." Professor Shi Erfu reminded, "As for the final treatment of the Demon King's soul, we still have to wait for Cynthia to come back before we make a decision. My subjective opinion is to seal it, but Ophelia's example shows me that just sealing it isn't safe. Refining it into a magic guide fairy card is indeed a very good idea, but the risk is very high. However, the risk of successfully refining magic was very high. No one could guarantee a 100% success rate in their experiments, even if it was a ritual. Therefore, we need to carefully consider whether or not to take this risk. As for what Dake said, that he hasn't mastered the ritual, that's not hard to solve. We can ask Ka Zaire to give him special treatment, and we can also help him set up the ritual when he wants to refine the card. In short, none of this is a problem. As long as the Demon King's soul can be successfully separated from White's soul. Hearing her say this, Ophelia suddenly became anxious again, but she didn't have any other options at the moment. We're all on the same side, so let's not talk about pretentious things. Professor Shi Erfu changed the topic. Let's talk about confidentiality now. You might not know about it in the academy. Because of Angus Jeffrey, the incident that happened in the academy has been noticed. Fortunately, White didn't reveal too much in the duel tonight, so luck is still on our side. In short, what happened tonight can't be revealed, and we have to come up with a way to hide it. That's easy. Dake raised his hand and said, we just have to push all the blame for Angus Jeffrey and White's misfortune to Underworld Fire. Underworld Fire? Everyone looked at each other, and they all agreed with Dake's quick thinking. Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but sigh. Underworld Fire. It is. Come to think of it, there's no more suitable excuse than this. In the past 6 months, the Holy Church has been in a terrible fix because of the things that leaked out from the door to the underworld, so they'll be very sensitive about it. However, the various signs that Angus Jeffrey and White Gouda showed are quite similar to when they were possessed by Underworld Fire. Dake crossed his fingers and said slowly, although not many people know, Angus Jeffrey was possessed by Underworld Fire a long time ago. They can't come into contact with White, but they can check on Angus Jeffrey. There had always been obvious signs that Angus Jeffrey had been possessed by the fire of the underworld. Unless they can find out the exact time of those signs, they'll only be led into a trap. Of course, if their understanding of Underworld Fire is really that detailed, not only will this excuse not work, but it will also be exposed. It won't be exposed. Professor Shi Erfu's lips curled up and he smiled. If it's the Holy Church, they'll understand. The Holy Church wouldn't want anything related to the Demon King's resurrection to be exposed. It was fine if they didn't investigate clearly, but once they did, the excuse of Underworld Fire would be a warning to them. They weren't fools. In this matter, the Holy Church would even help to hide it. Professor Shi Erfu said, we'll know the general situation by looking at Earl Jeffrey's reaction in the next few days. After that, they continued to discuss this topic for a while. They deliberated more about the details of the excuse and finally reached a consensus. As for the treatment of the White Gouda, they would put it aside for the time being. Professor Shi Erfu and Sister Ka Lien would send him to Professor Stephen Harvey's dormitory. Without Professor Ka Zaire, they could only rely on Sister Ka Lien to cooperate with Professor Stephen Harvey. In short, they would first look at Professor Harvey's diagnosis before talking about anything else. But as they talked, they inexplicably reached a consensus and decided to go to Professor Stephen Harvey's dormitory together. We're all just here to watch, Dake sighed in his heart. No one wanted to be left out. Everyone wanted to know the development of the situation as soon as possible. In the end, they couldn't bear to leave. Of course, there were also people like Ophelia Bullard who really cared about White's condition. But in short, they hid their tracks and soon arrived in front of Professor Stephen Harvey's dormitory. It was close to midnight and the night was extremely dark. But for Professor Stephen Harvey, this was just the beginning of a day. When he opened the door, his face was full of energy. People who saw Professor Stephen Harvey for the first time would usually be surprised. No one would think that this short little old man in pink pajamas and nightcap was the legendary necromancer who played with corpses and souls. But Dake was already very familiar with him. Professor Stephen Harvey was always kind and somewhat cute. Except for his cold jokes, he was very easy to get along with. Dimming, What's the matter? Well, there's a little guy over here who looks like he's in trouble. Oh, isn't this little bat? Why are you here again? This little guy over here. Oh, it's little bat. Professor Harvey, I'm no longer a vampire. Ophelia Bullard's expression turned a little awkward, and she hurriedly said, I know. You're a fresh blood. There's not much difference. Professor Harvey waved his hand. His eyes were completely attracted by the white Gouda. Although the white Gouda was still wrapped in the cocoon of wind, it was nothing to Professor Harvey. Choose 3 people to come in. You used the invisible needle to pin his soul. Is there a problem with that? Does the soul have legs and want to escape? He turned around and said, No, it doesn't have legs, but it has an extra head. Dake walked into the room. Then, Professor Shi Erfu also stepped over the threshold. But after thinking for a while, she handed the white Gouda to Sister Carl-Yen and stepped back. Sister Carl-Yen nodded slightly and walked into the room with the white Gouda. Then Ophelia Bullard immediately followed. After the 3 of them entered, Professor Shi Erfu closed the door and waited outside with the others. Professor Harvey's dormitory was his laboratory. If too many people entered, the laboratory would become crowded and messy. As he walked in, he asked Dake about the specific situation. Dake described in a few words how the white Gouda grew a second head in a more abstract way. Professor Harvey had a lot of experience in this. He always treated the patient but not the cause of the illness. I see. The 2 souls have fused together? So, do you want to save the little one or the mother? I mean, it's not possible to save both. I have a lot of experience in cutting souls. The overlapping part can't be cut. Otherwise, whether it's the big one or the little one, both will be paralyzed. Do you understand this situation? It's like a person who has 2 heads on his neck. You can only choose to cut one of the heads from the neck, but you can't divide the body into 2 halves equally. This should be easy to understand. Because it was so easy to understand, Ophelia Bullard froze. Sister Carrion, on the other hand, was stunned for a moment before asking, Professor Harvey, can the head you cut off breathe? Professor Harvey smiled and said, Hey, he won't necessarily die even if he only has 1 head left. Just put it in a jar. Why? Are the requirements so low? Dake interrupted helplessly. The basic requirement is that he won't die. If possible, he should be able to talk. It's best if his brain can still work. We need him to lead the way. Also, don't be mistaken. The one outside is the one that needs to be cut off. Professor Harvey said, Don't worry, I'm not an executioner. I'll confirm it in advance. Put him on the bed first. I need to do a thorough check and see the specific situation before making a conclusion. Fell asleep and didn't finish writing before 12 o'clock. Fortunately, it's not too late. It's not a big problem. I wrote less in the first few days of this month, but I made up for it in the middle. Hopefully, it can last for the second half of the month. The reward will be paid monthly. In the end, the number of words will be deducted from the number of days x 4,000. Now, the number of words I've updated has exceeded 100,000. One more update and I'll be able to finish the guaranteed minimum for this month, 28 days. After that, I'll be able to enter the game even more time. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Also, I actually have a very urgent problem that needs to be solved. What's a good name for Mr. Devil? Asking for votes. I'm already down. Chapter 733. Professor Stephen Harvey's dormitory was too clean. The room used for the experiment felt like a modern operating room, which was out of place with the outside environment. Sister Carl-Yen moved the white Gouda's body onto the snow-white experiment bed. Then, with a flick of her finger, she condensed a blade with her magic power and cut the wind cocoon around the white Gouda. The wind threads on the wind cocoon were cut off one by one, and the white Gouda's body was finally revealed. Professor Stephen Harvey looked at the 3 long needles that were nailed to his magic meridians, and then at the invisible nail that was nailing his soul in his head. He praised, "Good technique. Professor Harvey, Do you need me to undo it? Sister Carl Yen asked. Professor Stephen Harvey took out a magic card and summoned a pair of magic gloves. He said, "Wait for me to get ready." As soon as he finished speaking, he had already entered the state. First, he tapped lightly on Werthergod's face, causing Werthergod's slightly trembling body to suddenly stop. It was as if he was a corpse, not moving at all. Then, he took out several magic tools and set them up on the experiment bed with the help of the magic cards. When Sister Carl Yen pulled out the anti-magic needle and the invisible nail one after another, the experiment bed lit up with a corresponding magic array, replacing the functions of the anti-magic needle and the invisible nail, one by one. Although Professor Stephen Harvey's explanation was quite interesting, the state of the White Gouda's soul was actually very tricky. Once the restraint was loosened, the second consciousness, which was the soul of the Demon King, and the soul of the White Gouda would overlap again. Even Professor Stephen Harvey would have a hard time separating them intact. Remember, https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP. Fortunately, Dake and the others had successfully lured the Demon King's soul out, which saved them a lot of trouble. However, the following detailed examination was still very tedious. After a full half an hour, Professor Stephen Harvey raised his hand and sighed. "I've lived long enough to see this." Dake watched Professor Stephen Harvey's operation from beginning to end. Although he did not understand, he still asked, "What's going on?" Ophelia Bullard also said nervously, "Professor Harvey." Professor Stephen Harvey shook his head and said, "Even for a necromancer like me, this is the first time I've seen something like this." Sister Carl Yen was the only one among the three who could understand part of it. She couldn't help but frown. This demon, the soul of the second consciousness, was actually born from the soul of the White Gouda? And as soon as she said that, Ophelia Brad immediately understood. Her face turned pale, and she asked in surprise, "How is that possible?" Dake Dimming didn't understand and asked, "Wait, what's going on?" Professor Stephen Harvey patiently explained, "At first, I thought that another soul had invaded, parasitized, or fused with it, but that was not the case. You can imagine that the soul of the second consciousness grew out of the soul of the White Gouda, and according to its growth trend, under normal circumstances, it should absorb the power of God's soul and use it as nourishment for its growth. Eventually, it will absorb all the power of God's soul and bloom on its own, replacing God's soul. It shouldn't have been this kind of situation. However, although the form has changed, the essence hasn't changed." Dake frowned slightly and finally sorted out his thoughts. If the soul of the White Gouda was compared to a head, then the soul of the second consciousness was a seed stuffed into the head. This seed would absorb the power of the head and take root until it grew out of the head and bloomed. At that time, the soul of the White Gouda would be completely devoured, and the soul of the Demon King would take over the magpie's nest. And before that, they were actually in a state where they were in each other. The difference was that under normal circumstances, the reincarnation of the Demon King could only maintain one consciousness from the beginning, but now, there were two consciousnesses. In addition, even in the soul of the Demon King that was split, there was a part of the soul of the White Gouda. In short, the fusion between the soul of the Demon King and the soul of the White Gouda was several times stronger than when Professor Stephen Harvey saw it for the first time. If he cut off the part of the Demon King's soul that was split, he would also cut off the small part of the soul that belonged to the White Gouda that was fused with it. One's glory, all's glory. I can do it. After a long while, Professor Stephen Harvey still said, "But this level of soul-cutting experiment requires not only skill but also time. This will be an extremely long process." Soul-cutting, splitting, and gluing were the basic skills of a necromancer. As long as there was enough time, even if the soul was fused into a ball of paste, he could cut it apart bit by bit. Even though the soul that was glued together like this would shatter like glass when it was cut, if there was no other way, this was the only way. Then if... Dake was a little hesitant. Professor Stephen Harvey kindly said, "If you have any ideas, you can tell me." Dake said, "Since the soul of the second consciousness can devour the nutrients of the White Gouda and grow, what about the other way around? Can we let the soul of the White Gouda devour the soul of the second consciousness?" Professor Stephen Harvey nodded and praised, "I've thought of this idea before. But for some reason, even though the soul of the second consciousness was born later, it seems to be of a higher order than the soul of the white Gouda. It's difficult to subdue the top." Dake lowered his head and pondered, "Is that so?" But thinking about it, this was the only way. The white Gouda was actually just a container for the Demon King. Even though various unexpected factors caused them to coexist, there was no reason for the container to devour the master. Perhaps this was the reason why the soul of the Demon King had more control over its body than the white Gouda. But this made it even more difficult. "We need to discuss this situation," Dake said. Then they walked out of the dormitory and discussed the conclusion with Professor Shi Erfu and the others who were waiting outside. As expected, it won't be that smooth. Professor Shi Erfu glanced at Professor Midya with a reproachful look in his eyes. Professor Midya rolled her eyes and said, "What are you looking at?" "I'm just making a prediction." Professor Shi Erfu turned to look at Ophelia Blood and said, "If this situation is true, you might have to be mentally prepared that the soul of the Demon King and the soul of the white Gouda will coexist forever." Ophelia Blood's face was as gloomy as the sea. Sister Kalien comforted her, "Actually, we just need to seal away the part of the Demon King's consciousness, right?" Ophelia Blood slowly shook her head. "I know better than anyone how terrifying the Demon King is. It's like a maggot in a tarsal bone. Unless it's completely removed, just sealing it won't be enough." Professor Shi Erfu frowned and said, "Then let's wait for Ka Zayer." After a while, Dake and the other two entered the dormitory again. Professor Stephen Harvey was still methodically conducting a deeper examination of White. He asked without raising his head, "Is there a result from the discussion?" Dake said, "Professor, can you make a switch? A switch that can switch between the two soul consciousnesses at any time?" Professor Stephen Harvey said, "That's not difficult." Dake breathed a sigh of relief. "That's good. Finally, when it switches to White's consciousness, it can make the soul part of the second consciousness fall into a deep sleep." Professor Stephen Harvey nodded and said, "No problem." But then he raised his head and said, "I also have a request." Dake, "Okay, let's hear it." Professor Stephen Harvey's smile grew wider. "Count me in." This was a request to join the team. Professor Stephen Harvey was extremely interested in the state of White's soul and wanted to know more. Dake smiled and said, "I'll ask Professor Shi Erfu." Professor Stephen Harvey said, "Okay." Then Dake turned around and walked out. After half a minute, he came back and said, "Professor Shi Erfu said yes." Professor Stephen Harvey said proudly, "Of course. I've always had a good reputation. Now, can you tell me what this second consciousness you've been talking about is?" Dake nodded slowly and said in a deep voice, "It's the Demon King." Stephen Harvey, "Huh?" Dake repeated, "It's the Demon King." "Oh." Professor Stephen Harvey's hands trembled and almost dislocated White's arm. Of course, it was excitement, not fear. He immediately said in ecstasy, "You said this kid became the Demon King's vessel?" "I knew it, I knew it." Then he turned his head and said excitedly, "Then what's with the Demon King's soul? Is it related to what happened at Easter?" Doc glanced at Ophelia Bullard, then turned around and explained the details of the matter. Professor Stephen Harvey's eyes lit up as he listened. He rubbed his hands and asked, "There's a Demon King here, and there's another Demon King in the West?" Dake said, "It should be." Professor Stephen Harvey, "Then the Demon King in the West. I mean, its soul, it can't be that easy to deal with, right?" Dake laughed dryly and said, "It depends. After all, we're only guessing its existence." "Enough." Professor Stephen Harvey immediately said, "Remember to call me when you're ready to leave. I haven't been out for a few years. My old bones are getting rusty." However, as if to show off his value, he added, "As long as you give me a Demon King's soul that I can do whatever I want to research, and let me study the secret of its reincarnation, I might be able to deduce a way to perfectly separate Victor's soul from the Demon King's." As he spoke, he was already grinning from ear to ear. He was like an old man who had finally found a toy to play with after a long drought. His appearance was a little wretched. Dake looked at White, who was like a fish on a chopping board, and could not help but worry for him. "Child, life might be a little harder in the future, but please cheer up. You're the child of a hero, you can do it." Professor Stephen Harvey's addition was undoubtedly a strong support. And this way, the team for the expedition after Christmas would be even more complete. With such a strong team, dealing with a mere demon king shouldn't be a problem, right? Dake was a little worried as he left the room. At the same time, he thought regretfully, I originally planned to find time to go to the secret passage after Christmas. The matter of entering the secret passage to search for a new temple had been pushed back time and time again. Now, it could only be pushed back. But plans could not keep up with changes, and entering the secret passage in a hurry would not yield any results. The west is the demon race's territory, which is also the direction of the Freedom City. Should I bring Aurora along? I wonder if there's a chance to take a look at the Sun Moon Temple in the Freedom City. As he thought about it, Dake realized that he was actually getting excited. He hurriedly stopped his train of thought and calmed his emotions. After that, he continued to talk with Professor Shi Erfu and the others outside the door. Inside the door, Professor Stephen Harvey began to make the switch, with Sister Kalien's help and Ophelia's care. Before dawn, Sister Kalien opened the door and invited everyone in. Everyone surged in and was led to the living room to sit down. Dake walked into the laboratory and took a look. He saw that 2 black metal cubes the size of matchboxes had been installed on both sides of White Gouda's head. Black metal rings were attached to the neck and wrists of his limbs. Well, there was also a metal cube where the heart should be. White Gouda would probably not be able to sleep on his stomach for a while. Professor Stephen Harvey waved at him and took off his gloves. He walked out of the laboratory and conjured a total of 3 black metal cubes as if he were performing a magic trick. There were red and green buttons on each of the metal cubes. 3 switches, 2 backups. The red one is for the Demon King, and the green one is for White. Don't get it wrong. Professor Stephen Harvey put 2 of the 3 switches on the table and put away the last one. Leave this one with me. Press the red one, and the Demon King's soul consciousness will switch to the surface. The restraint ring on him will take effect and cut off the flow of magic power. Inject magic power into the switch, and he will be able to control his limbs. At this time, White's soul will not fall asleep. Press the green one, and it will switch to White's soul. The Demon King's soul will fall asleep, and the restraint ring will not take effect. Well, this is the request of this lady from the Blood Clan. Ophelia showed an expression of gratitude to him. Professor Shi Erfu, on the other hand, gave one of the remaining 2 switches to her and said, I'll leave this with you. Ophelia took the switch and said sincerely, Thank you. Professor Lili blinked his eyes and suddenly asked, Don't you want to try it first? Of course. Professor Shi Erfu narrowed his eyes with a smile and pressed the red button. After waking up, the Demon King got off the bed with a stiff expression and slowly walked out of the laboratory. I'm busy today, so I can't write more. I'll try harder tomorrow. Well, it seems that I've been awake for 24 hours and forced my schedule back. Let me see if I can keep it up. Tomorrow's update will probably be in the evening. I'll tell you in advance that I won't send any notifications in case the children are startled. I'll try to write more tomorrow. Okay. Chapter 734. What did you do to me? The Demon King, who still didn't know that he was a Demon King, immediately looked terrified and struggled with all his might. However, although its muscles were trembling, its body and limbs were involuntarily moving. Professor Shi Erfu made him squat down and cover his mouth with his hand. Little Li Li's eyes lit up when he saw this. He hurriedly reached out to grab the switch in Professor Shi Erfu's hand. Then, the Demon King suddenly stood up and tiptoed into Swan Lake. Ha ha ha. Professor Li smiled. Ophelia Brad's face twitched as she watched. However, when she thought about how the body being manipulated and played was that of her own child's, while the external consciousness was that of the Demon King who had died 10,000 times, she felt a sense of satisfaction. She was torn between the conflicting feelings of worry and pleasure. It wasn't until Professor Lily's 3 minutes cooled down and the green light dimmed that Werther God stopped dancing. He opened his mouth and screamed, "Ah!" This cry of his was actually not a cry he had just made, but a continuation of it in his consciousness. URL https://m Vipkanchu. VIP. Although everyone present was intelligent, they all made the same mistake at the same time. They had completely forgotten the consciousness of the White Gouda. Ever since the Demon King's consciousness was drawn out, the White Gouda had witnessed the Demon King's performance as a bystander. She was even able to communicate with the Demon King in the beginning. However, not long after, part of the Devil King's soul was pinned by Sister Kalien's invisible nail. After that, White discovered that her connection with the Devil King had been severed. Although he was unable to converse with the Demon King's consciousness in his spirit sea, he could still see and hear the sounds of the outside world. After that, the Demon King was bound by the wind threads, sealed by the Demon Sealing Needle, and hypnotized by Professor Shi Erfu. After the Demon King's consciousness fell into a deep slumber, the White Gouda thought that he could finally replace the Demon King. When he opened his mouth to speak, he was overjoyed. However, after several failed attempts, he was completely dumbfounded. After that, Dake and the others started a meeting in front of him. Therefore, White Gouda already knew how terrible his situation was. He also knew very well that the soul that had fused with him was the one that had caused his entire family to suffer. The Demon King. The White Gouda was different from the humans who cursed the Demon King every day but didn't have any direct hatred for him. The White Gouda had a deep hatred for the Demon King. His father, Hero Brett God, had died in the process of sealing the Demon King. His mother, blood concubine Ophelia Bullard, had also been corrupted by the Demon King and had been tortured in the Badia prison of the Holy Church for so many years. If it wasn't for the Demon King, he wouldn't have been alone until now. This blood feud must not be forgotten. When White Gouda found out that the second consciousness was the Demon King, he felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He was extremely shocked, and when he came to his senses, he immediately started cursing, using all the vicious words he had never used in his life. However, because he was pinned down by the invisible nail, his curses didn't reach the Demon King's ears. After that, White Gouda started to think about a dead end. After thinking for a long time, he gradually figured out a lot of things. For example, when he had just entered the school last year, why was he able to understand the book, Into the Abyss, that was encrypted with a secret ancient language? For example, he was the hero's son, so why was he under half-house arrest in the orphanage? If it wasn't for Principal Cynthia St. Aerti bringing him to the Shang Malian Academy, he might have been invited to the Academy of the Holy Church to begin the second round of surveillance and house arrest. For example, he had the bloodline of the hero, so why were most of the magic spirits refined from his blood monsters from the dungeon? Now that he knew the truth, all the answers came one after another, but they were hard for him to accept. Before he knew that he was the child of the hero, he was like most human children who worshipped the hero. After knowing that he was the child of the hero, he was proud of his identity. But in fact, although he was the child of the hero, there was a part of the blood that belonged to the Demon King in his body. This sudden information was enough to make an ordinary child's cognition collapse, and he might even go crazy. Fortunately, White Gouda still had some willpower. After struggling for a long time, he finally accepted the truth. But when he finally accepted the truth and was ready to face his bleak life, he was sent to Professor Stephen Harvey's experimental bed. Then he enjoyed the one-stop service of opening his skull, cutting his heart, cutting his throat, cutting his wrist, and so on. The only lucky thing was that he didn't have the more delicate senses of pain, touch, smell, and so on. Otherwise, he wouldn't be at this time, but a dull and stupefied person who couldn't even speak. No one could imagine what he had experienced during that time. When he saw Professor Stephen Harvey, it was like seeing a rabbit on a tiger's plate, and he couldn't help but tremble. White Gouda's mental health problem could be discussed later. Ophelia Brad hugged him to her side to comfort him. Professor Shi Erfu had already begun to test the effect of this switch. After the test was completed, Ophelia Brad suddenly patted White Gouda lightly, and he fell asleep. It's my fault for not taking care of his consciousness. I hope sleep can help him recover his calmness," Professor Stephen Harvey said apologetically. Ophelia Bullard hurriedly declined. This morning's discussion came to an end after a round of mutual rejection. After the people present agreed on their own words, they finally dispersed. However, because this place was originally a teacher's dormitory, Dake was the only one who walked out alone. He smiled a little helplessly, but his footsteps gradually became lighter. Although this incident had developed to this point, after discovering that White Gouda was the third party, and confirming the identity of his second consciousness, a part of the fog was finally lifted, and everything became clear. No matter how difficult the next action was, he wouldn't be like a headless fly running around. And regarding the foreseeable action after Christmas, he was actually a little excited. However, the moment he stepped into dorm 301, the lightness in his heart disappeared completely. The magic guiding fairies, who had been waiting bitterly in the dormitory all night, meowed as they drowned him out. It took Dake a whole hour to talk about the cause and effect of this incident to the curious babies while eating. However, he propped himself up and took a bath. Then, he collapsed onto the bed and fell into a deep sleep. He slept until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He propped up his sore eyes, hastily washed up and put on his clothes. Then, he busied himself again. The summary of last night's duel was secondary. The main thing was that today was already December 21st, and it was very, very close to Christmas Eve. Next, there were two major events waiting for him. One was the small experiment led by Professor Kazair, and the other was to capture the Devil King in the West. But both of these things would happen after Christmas, and he didn't need to do the preparations before then. After temporarily taking a break from these important events, he was faced with something that he couldn't avoid. Before the sky turned dark, Dake first went to find Foster Fernandi and took out the Christmas gifts he prepared for the first-year students. He temporarily stored them in the Magical Zoology Club's classroom. Then, he received a custom-made magic card from a senior. That was a Christmas gift for Deanna. After going back and forth, it was already evening. Without stopping to rest, he went to Traveller Street. In the next few hours, he prepared Christmas gifts for the students and maids that he missed. Finally, he got a limited Christmas simulation card in advance from a branch of the National Duel Club and bought a winter hat that could change its appearance. The simulation card was for Luo Boat, so it was convenient. As for the fashionable winter hat, he prepared to give it to White Gouda. In order to take care of this student who was seriously traumatized, he specially prepared this winter hat that was half a magic tool. Autumn went and winter came. The weather was cold, and the students gradually wrapped themselves in thick cotton-padded clothes, wearing all kinds of scarves and gloves. These clothes were just enough to cover the restraints on White's body, but the black metal boxes on both sides of his head were not so easy to cover. The two black metal boxes were like antennas. When the two consciousnesses in White's body fell asleep at the same time, the metal boxes would turn black. When the Devil King's consciousness was switched to the surface, the metal boxes would turn red. When White's consciousness was switched to the surface, the metal boxes would turn green. This way, other people would not be able to identify the boxes wrongly and leak information. Therefore, the two metal boxes could not be covered. But the hat Dake specially selected could change the color of the material by recognizing the special color of the hat. In other words, when the metal boxes turned red, the hat would turn red. When the metal boxes turned green, the hat would turn green. This way, White could wear the winter hat in the cold winter. While keeping warm, it could also cover the two metal boxes so that he would not receive strange looks from other people. In order to prepare such a hat, Dake could be said to have put in a lot of effort. But who told him to be such a kind-hearted youth? Doing good deeds was not tiring. The next day was Sunday. Dake got up early and entered Traveller Street. Seeing that the Christmas ball was the night after tomorrow, more and more students came to Traveller Street. Dake hesitated for a long time before finally entering a famous jewelry store on the street. When he came out again, there was a ruby ring in his hand. After buying the ring, he went to the Wind Traveller's material store and picked up a few materials that might be useful. The Wind Traveller was a low-priced store. The materials in the store were good and cheap. Of course, their grades were not high. But what he was looking for were not high-grade materials. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, Dake had already returned to the dormitory. Then, without hesitation, he began his magical engineering experiment on the spot. Using the ruby ring as the core material, supplemented by various low-grade materials, and minimizing the personal characteristics, the final magic card that was refined was most likely an ordinary magic card that everyone could use. But Dake was still a little unsatisfied. In the final refinement, he added 1 point of the lunar goddess version of bliss. 1 point. It was really only 1 point. 1 point of the lunar goddess version of bliss was only equivalent to 3 points of the Dake version of bliss. And it dissected the relationship with Dake as much as possible. But this was still a very big gamble. He was quite satisfied with the final product. After putting away the item card that was finally refined, Dake was finally completely relieved. Everything was ready. All that was left was to wait for Christmas, for the Yule Ball to arrive. Before that, he still had some time to continue his research and experiments on the magic golem. Since the holidays after Christmas had already been booked, he had to hurry up with the research on the magic golem. So, on the night of February 22nd, Dake Dimeng took Meow Meow and began further experiments on the production of Little Magnetic Monster. Little Magnetic Monster was a type of gray magnet Pokemon. Its body was a metal ball with a huge eye in the middle. There was a large screw on the top of its head, 2 small screws in front of its body, and a horseshoe-shaped magnet on the left and right sides of its body. The 2 horseshoe-shaped magnets had opposite magnetic poles. Little Magnetic Monster could emit electromagnetic waves from its left and right parts to block gravity and float in the air. It was an electric and steel-type Pokemon. Most importantly, it looked like a small mechanical magic golem. Before this, Dark had used the bronze eyeball as the core to create the outer shell of the Little Magnetic Monster. Later, when he was busy, Meow Meow successfully solved the manufacturing problem of Little Magnetic Monster. It installed huge horseshoe-shaped magnets on both sides of its body, causing it to release electromagnetic waves under the drive of the nucleus. At this point, the production of the magic golem was actually not that difficult anymore. If he was lucky, he might be able to successfully make a little magnetic monster that could discharge electricity before tomorrow night. Knock, knock, knock. When the door was knocked, Dake was biting the screw and studying the magic circuit inside Little Magnetic Monster. He didn't have time to open the door. Fairy Tale Animal, Little Rabbit, who seemed to have nothing to do, stepped on the vertically placed tree stump like a circus clown, strolled to the door, and opened it. The cold wind that blew in from the crack of the door made Little Rabbit squint its eyes, and then it was immediately carried into the arms of the person who came to visit. Fairy Tale Animal, Little Rabbit, struggled with its short legs, but the huge force exerted on its body made it unable to do anything. Anna waited until Luo Si came in before she closed the door behind her. She carried Little Rabbit and walked to Dake's side, and asked curiously, "Are you making a magic golem?" "Yeah," Dake answered without raising his head. Anna rolled her eyes and said, "There's a chick protection mission tonight. Aren't you going to take a look?" "Huh?" Dake stopped what he was doing and asked curiously, "Tonight?" "Yeah, tonight." Anna's big eyes narrowed into crescents as she said with a smile. Dake couldn't help but be surprised. He actually didn't have much contact with other people in the past 2 days, so he didn't know. He originally thought that this year's chick protection mission would be held on Friday night, which was the night of the White Inspection. So when he was free, he felt a little regretful that he missed such a fun event. If it weren't for Anna and Luo Si who came to inform him, he might have forgotten about the mission. "I have to go." This idea suddenly flashed through Dake's mind. Although he really wanted to join in the fun and enjoy the show, he actually had a very legitimate reason. On the surface, the so-called chick protection action was a protective activity organized to prevent the younger students from getting carried away by the romantic atmosphere of Christmas. Later on, it changed its meaning slightly and became a kind of activity that hindered love. It seemed that since a few years ago, the slogan of the chick protection mission had been "No love, no harm." However, after experiencing the chick protection mission for the past few years, Dake already knew that "no love, no harm" was a slogan full of double standards. The senior girls protected the junior girls and didn't let the boys easily get close to them, but at the same time, they encouraged the girls to bravely express their affection to the boys they liked. At first glance, it seemed that the chick protection mission had become an activity of girls picking on boys. In short, the boys and girls of the first grade were the protagonists of this stage. My schedule is broken again. I'm tired as a cat after running around for a whole day. I'm going to resume my normal update rhythm. Begging for votes. Chapter 735. Even though he was a first-year mathematics assistant, Dark still felt like he had to go to the common lounge to take a look. Of course, he mainly wanted to see his cousin Joey. Aurora and the two little princesses did not have to worry about the first-year students of the noble compound. It was only his cousin that made him worry. But when he temporarily put down the experiment in his hands and went to the common room with Deanna and Luosi, he realized that even this worry was completely unnecessary. This year's Operation Chick Protection was completely different from last year's. What's going on? Dake just came out of the staircase and blinked his eyes. His face showed a strange expression. Deanna laughed and pushed him out of the staircase. Luosi behind him also had a mischievous look on her face. These two had obviously already gone down and more or less understood the situation. However, he saw that the chicks, who were supposed to be protected, were now on the opposite side of the upperclassmen girls. And the leaders were naturally the two little princesses. Oh, even Joey was sitting next to them. Dake saw the three of them together for the first time. All the first-year girls of the noble compound were clustered around them. Their aura was amazing and was not weaker than the upperclassmen at all. Remember the website, Vipkanshu. Vian the so-called upperclassmen. In fact, other than the first-year students, they were all considered upperclassmen in this situation. In other words, the first-year boys from last year had now become the wolves that needed to be guarded against in the Operation Chick Protection. And the chicks that were protected last year were now old hens protecting their chicks. But now it seemed that the chicks did not want to be protected behind them. Dake glanced around and looked at the lineup of boys near the door. Doran and the others who had already turned into wolves were among them, as if they were facing a great enemy. The first-year boys were slightly at a loss and did not know how to deal with this situation. Although the first-year boys in the past were not able to cause a storm, at least there was a sense of unity and it would not be like this. But this year's first-year girls were too strong. The boys were usually suppressed to the point that they could not breathe. At this time, they were even more useless. The atmosphere in the common room was so tense that it was suffocating. Dake winked at Deanna and Luosi before he tried to slip past them and sneak into the group of second-year boys. He didn't see Aurora among the first-grade girls, but she couldn't have been forced to participate in this kind of activity. Hey, isn't this Dake? However, just as he pulled away from Deanna and Luosi, he suddenly heard Dolong shout. That shout was particularly conspicuous in this deathly silent environment. Almost everyone turned their heads in the direction of his voice. On the other hand, Doran nudged Pittan's waist and whispered, "Look, the solution is here." But Pittan muttered, "How is this a strategy to break out of a stalemate? This is a ploy to blow up the field." But any second-year student would never forget the terrifying scene of almost all the girls inviting Dake to the ball during last year's Chick Protection mission. Although the second-year girls this year were not as naive as last year, if Dake was present, they would more or less compare the invitees with Dake when they accepted the invitation to the ball. With such a comparison, wouldn't it be easy to compare all sorts of things? Things that were originally barely acceptable would suddenly become difficult to accept. And things that were originally good would become not so good. To put it bluntly, it would raise their bottom line of acceptance. This was not a good thing for the majority of the boys. Today's second-year boys of the aristocrats' courtyard did not find a dance partner at last year's Christmas ball. These days, they had been solemnly vowing to avenge their previous humiliation. Wouldn't this be difficult? Pittan cursed in his heart with a bitter expression. He knew that Doran already had someone in his heart and was not planning on finding a dance partner among the second-year students of the aristocrats' courtyard this year. He also knew that Doran had secretly sent an invitation to the head of the Magi courtyard and was waiting for a reply day and night. But Doran already had someone in his heart, and he did not. The little fatty also wanted a dance partner. But Doran had already spoken. No matter how much Pittan wanted to complain, he could not change reality. He could only thicken his face and summon Dake over. Dake was already used to being the center of attention. His footsteps did not change as he walked over to the second-year group as usual and sat with Doran, Pittan, and the others at the same table. "What's the situation?" Dake asked excitedly as soon as he sat down. This year, Doran was like a little teddy bear who had jumped out of the 3 realms and was not in the 5 elements. He was not troubled and was as excited as Dake. He immediately whispered, "It's difficult." They originally thought that after becoming second years, they could be like last year's second-year seniors and target their juniors. In the end, you saw it too. Dake glanced at the 2 little princesses who were glaring at him and Joey who was hiding behind them to vote. He couldn't help but laugh. Then what do we do? At the end of the semester, perhaps the professors had reached some sort of consensus, but apart from the 6th year, all the other grades had sunk into a heavy workload. Although the little Magus had tried his best to find time in between the cracks, he still hadn't been able to do anything before the holidays. Those who wanted to take the initiative to express their affection had no time to plan, and those who had received an invitation or a confession were not in the mood to pay attention. Thus, it had been delayed again and again until now. If they could not find a dance partner in these last 2 days, this year's Christmas ball would be much more deserted than the past. Under these circumstances, this year's Protecting the Young had instead become a matchmaking event in the aristocrats' courtyard. No matter male or female, many people hoped to find a dance partner tonight. Almost all the second-year boys had the same thought. However, before they could muster up the courage to make a move on the first-year girls who looked like little lambs, they found that 2-3 shepherd dogs had suddenly emerged from the group of lambs. Every time a boy wanted to take out an invitation letter and walk towards their target, they would immediately be met with fierce glares from Anna and Enchi. Not only did the first-year girls not feel repulsed by this, but they also gladly accepted their protection. From time to time, they would cover their mouths and snicker. As for the second-year girls and above, on one hand, they were angry because their authority, fun, had been taken away, and on the other hand, they were irritated because the little princesses had made the atmosphere so stiff. It wasn't only the boys who wanted to find a dance partner. If you make the atmosphere so stiff, how would the girls who wanted to invite the boys feel? The above was the reason why the current situation had become like this. However, with the appearance of Dake dimming, the atmosphere that had been in a deadlock for a long time finally had a loophole. Whether it was the first year or the senior girls, they all began to whisper to each other. The first-year girls, except for the 3 shepherd dogs, almost all looked at him with longing in their eyes. A few of them had already secretly reached into their bags for the dance invitations that had yet to be filled in. Unlike those so-called seniors who couldn't be seen or touched, Dake Dimeng was the first-year mathematics teaching assistant. He was also the senior that they interacted with the most. Moreover, in the eyes of many people, this senior was synonymous with perfect and flawless. It was normal for the first-year students to have feelings of admiration for him. However, before the first-year girls could make a move, the second-year girls had already taken the initiative to attack. Just like last year, these girls who had invited Dake to the dance before last Christmas, after hesitating for a long time, actually stood up again this year. As they stood up, Dake seemed to hear the heartbreak of someone next to him. The sound of the heartbreak was like glass shattering, making him feel a little embarrassed. But he was still calm on the surface. With his thick skin, he rejected the girls' invitations one by one. When the girls returned in disappointment, Dake quietly breathed a sigh of relief. He was here to watch the melons, not to be a melon. Among the second-year girls over there didn't seem to be Eudora's figure, which made him quietly relieved again. That's right, right? Boys and girls who want a dance partner should take the initiative. Don't bring the fire to our side. And after those few girls, some of the boys seemed to have discovered that there was someone in the group of girls who was ready to make a move. A few of the boys who targeted that girl couldn't sit still anymore. They picked up their invitation letters and wanted to rush out. One of them even conjured a bouquet of red roses as if he was performing a magic trick. This boy also became the first boy to be invited since the beginning of tonight's chick protection action. That's worth celebrating, that's worth celebrating. And once there was one, there would be two. Since someone had already set an example, the boys and girls who were ready to go no longer hesitated. Finally, some people stood up one after another. This chick protection action finally got on the right track after Dake's arrival. Dake sat there and watched with interest most of the time. He listened to some small gossip that spread among the students from Doran's mouth. Occasionally, he would meet girls who came to express their affection, but they were all rejected by him one by one. Among these girls, there were juniors and seniors. Even among the girls who were 3 or 4 years older than him, there were some who coveted him. Dake was used to it, but he didn't care too much. He looked like he had been immersed in the forest for a long time. The tower of the aristocrat house was like this. Although the towers of the other academies didn't hold the chick protection action, they actually had similar activities. Boys and girls, some liked each other, some didn't like each other, and some were sincere and utilitarian. In short, most people were working hard to get together as a couple. Among them, the most elegant were the students of the Sorcerer Academy. The girls of the Sorcerer Academy prepared many riddles to test the boys they liked. The activities of the Knight Academy were more direct. Boys and girls, surrounded by everyone, loudly expressed their schemes. If they succeeded, they could. If they didn't, they would change to the next one. If there were 2 boys pursuing a girl, and the girl was hesitant, they would use a duel. This was a program that could only be seen in the Knight Academy's tower. It had always been highly recommended by onlookers. On the other hand, the tower of the Fool's Academy was more ordinary and more reserved. The students would secretly instruct their never-before-seen magic fairies to act as messengers and deliver invitations to their targets at a fixed time. If they agreed, they would write back. If they didn't, they would ignore them. At this moment, Victoria was looking at the invitation letters that were piled up into a small hill with an adorable expression. As one of the 4 first-year Daimings of the Diming, Victoria was outstanding in both her family background and appearance. Her somewhat mischievous personality was also very popular in the Fool's Academy. Under normal circumstances, it would be normal for her to receive more invitations to balls. However, she was a magic fairy. It had been a semester since she entered the academy. If there were still people who couldn't tell that she was a magic fairy, those students would have studied Magic Introduction in vain. Therefore, Victoria didn't have any illusions from the beginning. It was impossible for anyone to invite her to dance. Therefore, she made up her mind early on. On the night of the Christmas ball, she would shamelessly pester Dake and dominate him. However, she still received a large number of invitations to the ball. Victoria looked at the invitations and was somewhat happy but also a little worried. After thinking for a long time, she picked out one and opened it. Hey, isn't this? However, when she opened the first invitation, it was a girl's name. She looked at it carefully with some suspicion and confirmed that it was a girl in the same grade. Then, she picked up the second invitation and opened it again. It was her little best friend. She opened it again. It was her desk mate. She opened it again. It was finally a boy. Victoria was touched. However, when she took a closer look, she found that the invitation was from a senior. That senior described his desire for her with burning passion. He wanted to thoroughly study her from the inside out. Victoria felt a chill and hurriedly threw it into the trash can. Then, her cheeks puffed up and she pouted as she swept the rest of the invitations into the trash can. Only a few invitations from her friends in the same grade were left. Refresh it later. She looked carefully with some suspicion and confirmed that it was a girl in the same grade. Then, she picked up the second invitation and opened it again. It was her little best friend. She opened it again. It was her desk mate. She opened it again. It was finally a boy. Victoria was touched. However, when she took a closer look, she found that the invitation was from a senior. That senior described his desire for her with burning passion. He wanted to thoroughly study her from the inside out. Victoria felt a chill and hurriedly threw it into the trash can. Then, her cheeks visibly puffed up, and she pouted her lips. Chapter 736. Anna was under a lot of pressure. In terms of relationship, she and Luosi had been the closest to Dake since they entered the first year. Their relationship was so close that rumors between Dake and them could often be heard in the academy. Moreover, some of the rumors were filthy and extremely embarrassing. Although she also had those embarrassing thoughts, she didn't act on them in the end. And if she didn't act on them, it was naturally equivalent to nothing. Her and Luosi's plan had always been slow. They tried to break down Dake's heart step by step through day after day and time, and finally reap the fruit and tie the knot. This method of boiling the frog in warm water was indeed more suitable for them. After all, they were still young and not even adults. Moreover, they were very reserved and relatively traditional in their feelings. If things were to proceed normally like this, perhaps success would follow naturally. However, there were many things in this world that were always full of variables. Once the timeline of something was stretched to a certain extent, then variables would always follow one after another. First website. https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP4D Anna and Luosi. Eudora's appearance was a small variable. And the appearance of Panduola Doragon was a huge variable that could not be ignored. Dake's relationship with Panduola had not been hidden. Anna and Luosi had known of her existence for a long time, and even built a pretty good friendship with her through Dake. But before that, Dake's attitude towards Panduola was not absolutely different from his attitude towards them. Dark had always been passive, and there were signs that he had deliberately avoided getting too close to her. For people he had a good impression of, he basically maintained an ambiguous attitude of not rejecting or taking the initiative. However, all the signs during this period of time showed that he was turning from passivity to initiative. If the person who was turning from passivity to initiative was herself, Anna would definitely hug the panda and roll around on the bed. She would be so excited that she wouldn't be able to sleep for several days. However, that was not the case. Anna was actually afraid that her sudden confession would be rejected. However, if she didn't take action now, she was even more afraid that she wouldn't even have the chance to express her feelings. Therefore, during this period of time, she had been carefully preparing Christmas gifts and making an invitation to the ball. But every time she wanted to send out the invitation to the ball, she would hesitate. Because she suddenly realized that with her relationship with Dark, sending out an ordinary invitation to the ball had lost its meaning. This reminded her of last year's Christmas. On the same night before Christmas, she had invited Dake to the dance party, only to find out that Panduola had beaten her to it. However, Dake didn't reject her invitation because of that. Instead, he invited her to the second half of the dance party. She agreed and was very happy. At that moment, she knew that Dake liked her. But now, it seemed that it wasn't the love she wanted. If this year was the same as last year, and he sent out ordinary invitations in private, the probability of getting the same result would be more than 90%. She didn't like mathematics because it had too many twists and turns. However, she liked the mathematics he wrote, so she bit the end of a pen and worked hard to learn it. Subconsciously, she used probability. More than 90% was actually considered very low. If it wasn't for the fact that 100% was too absolute, she would have said 100%. Dake definitely wouldn't reject her. However, she didn't want to be his partner for the second half of the dance party. She wanted to be the first partner to enter the dance floor with him in the first half. Thus, under Rose's persuasion, Diana finally made up her mind to send out the invitation to the ball in front of everyone under the pretext of Operation Chick Protection. Although it was only an invitation to the ball, with Dake's intelligence and gentleness, he definitely knew what it meant. Anna wanted to use this method to clearly tell Dake that she was no longer ignorant. She wanted Dake to face her feelings and not treat them as family. Even if this caused a rift between the two of them, there was no other way. If she didn't do anything, it would definitely be late for this year's Christmas ball. Dake wouldn't let her replace Panduola's position because of this or that. However, she had to prepare in advance, a whole year in advance, to pave the way for next year's Christmas ball. If she started to pave the way now, there shouldn't be anyone earlier than her, right? Hurry up and go. Luo Si's voice came from behind with a slight tremble. Anna tightly grasped the ball invitation in her hand and tightly pursed her pink lips. It was not easy for a girl to send an invitation to a ball that was destined to not get the result she wanted in front of so many people. However, after a long mental journey, the invitation was finally sent to Dake Dimming. Dake Dimming raised his hand and grabbed the corner of the invitation. He looked at Anna, who was trying her best to remain calm, and the smile on his face was no longer casual. The young master of the Duke's mansion, who had been laughing ever since he came downstairs to eat melons, was finally defeated. Did you receive it? Anna's voice became as soft as a mosquito's, revealing the unique shyness of a girl. Dake exerted force on his fingers and pulled the ball invitation to his side, but it didn't move. He was silent for half a second because of this, and then he whispered, "I received it." Of course he received it, and he had received it a long time ago. However, Anna was still too young. Although he watched the first and second grade students indulging in their youth with relish, he wouldn't change his mind because of this. 12 or 13 years old was really too young. Although the age of adulthood in this world was once set at 14 years old, after the arrival of peace, the age of adulthood had been changed to 16 years old. In the next few years, it would be further changed to 18 years old. According to the age of the current world, 16 years old was considered a minor. Dake's bottom line for dating was also 16 years old. Of course, this was a requirement for the person he was dating. After all, his body's age didn't count. The boys and girls in this world grew up faster on average, and sometimes people would be confused about their age. However, this kind of confusion wouldn't happen to Anna. Anna was originally more petite than her peers, but her heart had a charm that didn't match with her body size. In short, she looked younger than 13 years old. Before she grew up, Dake couldn't give her a positive response. By the way, Panduola was already 16 years old. The truth of the matter was sometimes this simple. Dark's active and passive behavior was also affected by the environment he was in. If he could already roughly control the sudden growth of bliss, he dared to be slightly more active. As for senior sister Pandora, she had already grown up and exceeded his age limit. Besides that, Dake was actually very clear about what he liked and what he didn't like. Because of his gradual control of bliss, he was actually very sensitive to the emotional changes of the people around him. Just like Luo Si's emotional changes, she had hidden them very well, but in fact, in Dake's eyes, they were as obvious as a mark of favorability. In short, Dake accepted Anna's invitation to the dance party. If it was like last year, it wouldn't be so obvious this time. However, he had already changed his approach and rejected all the other letters except for this dance party invitation. As a result, his action of accepting Diana's invitation letter seemed a little different. Of course, in the eyes of the second years, Anna was probably already Dake's woman, so this little surprise was only at the level of, as expected, or, I knew it. However, among the first years, there were still some people who widened their eyes unhappily. However, because of their identity and status, they couldn't do this kind of thing in front of the public, so they could only stare and watch. Anna, who received Dake's response, blushed uncharacteristically. She suppressed her shyness and ran back to the second-year girls. The second-year girls of the aristocratic academy all smiled dotingly at her. Even the few girls who were rejected by Dake smiled kindly and habitually fed her. Luo Si hugged Anna and said like a mother, "You did very well, good girl." Anna hid in her arms. "Hey." While most people's attention was focused on Anna, Doran leaned over to Dake's ear and whispered, "What exactly are you thinking?" Doran was quite sharp sometimes. Dake put the dance party invitation into his card bag and didn't open it on the spot. He didn't answer Doran either. At this time, the more he said, the more mistakes he would make. No matter what answer he gave, it wouldn't be appropriate. Fortunately, the melodramatic drama between the male and female seniors that followed quickly attracted most of the people's attention. Dake watched it with interest and pretended that nothing had happened. This unique Operation Protect the Chick lasted until 9:30 in the evening. Because it was already the holidays, the students didn't have any intention of going back to sleep. Even though the Operation Protect the Chick was already in a half-finished state, the common lounge was still noisy and lively. A few leaders suddenly proposed to decorate the common lounge in the next 2 days. The students responded loudly and looked forward to Christmas more and more. In this lively atmosphere that didn't dissipate for a long time, Dake Dimming quietly left the common lounge and returned to dorm 301. Meow Meow, who was sitting on the lab table and writing magic circuit boards, glanced at him with an extremely disdainful expression and continued to work hard. Dake couldn't help but smile awkwardly and walked to the lab table subconsciously. But after sitting down, he suddenly slapped his forehead and took out Anna's dance party invitation from his card bag. The cover of this dance party invitation was dark with bright stars all over. On the upper right corner, there was a galaxy vortex, and in the vortex, there was a drawing of Santa Claus driving a car. Compared to most of the invitations that had Christmas red as the main color, Anna's invitation could be said to be very carefully selected. Doc paused for a moment before opening the cover, revealing the contents inside. Since it was a dance party invitation, the invitation and the names of the two people were naturally written inside. Dake's eyes quickly fell on the picture of a cat and a bear next to the two names. In the next second, a weak mana fluctuation suddenly appeared in the invitation letter. Then, the little bear on the paper suddenly broke out of the paper and grew with the wind. In the blink of an eye, it grew to the size of a basketball and then, with a paw sound, it hugged Dake's face. What a cheek hugger! Dake pulled the cheek hugger off his face expressionlessly. In his mind, he was already imagining the miserable scene when he opened it in the common lounge. The little bit of guilt that he originally felt towards Anna also disappeared without a trace. After returning to the dorm, Anna looked at the dance party invitation on the desk and suddenly let out a cry of panic. "What's wrong, Nana?" Luosi frowned and asked. Anna grabbed the dance party invitation on the desk and stammered, "It's over. It's over. I gave him the wrong invitation. I gave him the one that I made at the beginning." Luosi immediately understood after being stunned for a short while. Suddenly, his face changed and he covered his head. "Stupid." Dake continued to make the Little Magnetic Monster Golem. Little Magnetic Monster was a Pokemon that could discharge electricity. If he could successfully make a Little Magnetic Monster Golem with the ability to generate electricity, he would have the foundation to build a small power plant. Although the magic engineering technology in this world was enough to satisfy most of the daily needs, Dake still missed electrical appliances. If possible, he didn't mind making some electrical appliances. The creation of magic tools was a part of alchemy. After half an hour, Dake gradually got into the zone. He looked like he was going to finish making the Little Magnetic Monster that very night. However, at 10:30 p.m., there was a dong 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 sound outside the door again. Meow, the dream demon slowly floated to the entrance and then opened the door. The night breeze blew in through the gap of the door, and a strong fragrance also blew in. The magic engineering fairies, who had already curled up in their small beds and were about to fall asleep, almost subconsciously opened their eyes wide. Then, a few little gluttonous ghosts got off the bed. After more than a month, Aurora Montefiore once again appeared at the door of dorm 301 with a midnight snack. Her bangs were flat, and she was obedient and cute. There was a faint blush on her white and tender cheeks. It was unknown whether it was because of the heat or some other reason. She pushed the door open and entered, her little finger slightly trembling in nervousness. "Good evening, Dake. I stewed a pot of chicken soup." Surrounded by the little cuties, Aurora walked into the dorm very naturally and then put down the tray on the desk. "Yes, I have something to tell you." Dake put down the tools in his hands. "Anan, see you tomorrow morning." Chapter 737. The night was like silk, and amidst the thick fragrance of meat, Aurora was carefully raising her head and secretly looking at the side profile of the exquisite jade-like face in front of her. That smile that overflowed from the corner of her mouth because she was enjoying the delicacy always made her little heart thump. Every time this happened, she would feel that all her research and hard work had been worth it. It was indeed true that love was born after a long time. Giving and enjoying over a long period of time could actually improve a relationship. But was it love? Love was something that couldn't be clearly described. "Is something the matter?" she asked softly. Her heart was filled with thoughts about the ball. But Dake didn't mention the ball. "After Christmas, we're going to the West." The West? Aurora was startled, and her expression became serious. The West was the territory of the demons, but that was already in the past. Although the environment in the West was still dangerous, the demons' territory was far less terrifying than it used to be. Remember the URL. Vip Kanchu. 6 After more than 10 years of rest, the kingdom was now ready to make a move on the land in the West. All the forces had the intention of opening up a wasteland in the West. And in the early stages of the kingdom's reconstruction, the City of Freedom had already been established between the West and the kingdom. Naturally, it became a springboard for the development of the West. Therefore, the City of Freedom's presence was gradually becoming stronger. And such an obvious piece of meat would of course attract the attention of countless jackals and wolves. Not only did these jackals and wolves not contribute during the construction of the City of Freedom, but they also frequently obstructed it. After the City of Freedom had shown its great value, they wanted to interfere and pick the peach. How could there be such a good thing in the world? In order to prevent the hybrid homeland that she had painstakingly built from being eaten away by these greedy people, City Lord Montefiore almost took on everything by herself. But there was a limit to how much a person could bear. The situation in the City of Freedom was becoming more and more dangerous with the flow of time. After more than 10 years of development, the human kingdom had recovered to its peak. The magical beasts in the West naturally multiplied after more than 10 years of reproduction. Although the adventurers in the City of Freedom hunted magical beasts day and night, compared to the magical beasts in the West, it was still a drop in the bucket. Moreover, the destruction of the demon race was not entirely a good thing. The demons demonized wild beasts and created a large number of magical beasts, but at the same time, they controlled and restricted the reproduction of magical beasts. Countless magical beasts under the control of the demons died in the meat grinder called war, which in turn kept the number of magical beasts at a constant balance. As the first magical beasts multiplied and formed new species after countless years, the remaining magical factors in their bodies decreased. More and more magical beasts developed rationality and were no longer irrational beasts. Their meat had also become edible. The last remaining bit of demonic nature was almost nothing to the demons. Therefore, when the demons were still around, the number of magical beasts never went out of control. But now that the demons in the West had been completely wiped out, the magical beasts had lost their natural enemy, and once again stood at the top of the food chain. Their reproduction was no longer restricted, and in a short 10 years, they had multiplied more than in the previous decades. As for the humans who had exterminated the demons, they had no time to take over the responsibilities of the demons because of their heavy losses. Due to the combination of many factors, the magical beasts in the West were developing into a huge threat that was perhaps not inferior to the demons. Even if it was just to nip that threat in the bud, it was imperative to open up the wasteland in the West. But under these circumstances, the humans were still scheming against each other. The current situation in the Freedom City was very bad. Aurora was very familiar with the current situation in the Freedom City, but one of the reasons why Mayor Montefiore had sent her to the Duke's residence and sent her to the Shang Malian Academy was to keep her away from danger. In other words, the situation in the Freedom City had already reached such a dangerous level. "Going to the West, is there something to take care of?" Aurora asked in a low voice. Dake drank chicken soup and bit into shredded meat, saying, "I can't say the specifics, but there's a high possibility that they'll settle down in the Freedom City." Aurora turned her little head and asked, "Who will be going?" Dake thought for a moment and said, "Professor Shi Erfu will lead the team." "So it's a mission from the Academy." Aurora let out a small sigh of relief and said, "Then, we don't have to do anything, right?" Dake nodded and said, "Yes, with the professors there, we naturally don't have to do anything." It's just that we're not sure if we'll need to go as far as the Freedom City. But if we do, you don't have to follow the team for the time being. Aurora subconsciously asked, "Then what about you?" "Me?" Dake muttered, "Although I really want to say that they can't do without me, I don't think they'll have anything to do with me. I'm participating in this expedition with the mentality of increasing my experience." Aurora's eyes gradually lit up, and she said with slight excitement, "Then if there's a chance, I'll take you around the city." Dake smiled and said, "Of course, I also want to know how the Freedom City looks like." It was said that the Freedom City had already established an adventurers' guild and was gradually becoming the largest gathering center of adventurers in the country. It wasn't easy for him to be reborn into a world of swords and magic. Dake actually wanted to find time to experience the life of an adventurer in those otherworldly transmigration novels, such as going out of the city to slay a slime or something. This trip with the professor this time, he'd just take it as a scouting trip. After the end of his second year, he could consider accompanying Aurora to the Freedom City again for a month or two. As the two chatted, Aurora began to introduce the various sights and sounds of the Freedom City. She and the Freedom City grew up at almost the same time, so her understanding of the Freedom City was already ingrained in her bones. She casually mentioned some fascinating and interesting things that made people want to go and take a look. Unknowingly, the large pot of chicken soup had been finished, but the magic elf quietly put away the bowls and chopsticks and listened attentively, a yearning for the Freedom City gradually appearing in their eyes. Then, at 11 o'clock at night, Aurora carried an empty plate and went out with a satisfied look on her face. It wasn't until she returned to the dormitory on the second floor that she suddenly woke up, and her small face instantly fell. Her invitation to the ball was still hidden in her card bag. "Why do I feel like I've forgotten something?" After eating and listening to the story, Dake Dimming slightly shook his head and continued to make the little magnetic monster golems. As a result, the first little magnetic monster golem was successfully completed before 12 o'clock. Then, when Dake ordered it to release electromagnetic waves to float in the air, it exploded. Fortunately, the tower dormitory's soundproofing was good. Otherwise, how many students would wake up in the middle of the night from their dreams? Dake's face darkened as he carefully took the bronze eyeball out of the golem's remains. After inspecting it, he sighed softly. Good thing it's not broken. It wasn't easy to find a core like the bronze eyeball that was suitable for the little magnetic monster. If it was broken, he wouldn't be able to find a replacement in such a short time. He wasn't discouraged by the failure. After a simple tidying up, he actively searched for the reason for the failure and prepared to make another one the next morning. He went to bed at 1 o'clock and woke up at 6 o'clock. After 5 hours of sleep, Dake Dimming opened his eyes and found that Meow Meow was still sitting on the experiment table, doing nothing. He knew that the magic elf didn't need much sleep, so he let it be. After a simple wash, Dake came to the experiment table and found that Meow Meow had finished making the little magnetic monster's shell and was rushing to engrave the magic circuit. Dake sat down and worked together with it. With Meow Meow's tireless efforts, the second little magnetic monster was finally created before 8 o'clock. Compared to the first little magnetic monster, the second little magnetic monster was obviously much better. Not only could it release electromagnetic waves to shield itself from gravity and float in the air, but it could also successfully discharge electricity, electrocuting itself. Boom! After another failure, the dejected man and cat decided to start their third experiment. After the first two failures, Dake and Meow Meow finally had a slight breakthrough in their golem-making skills. They successfully created the third little magnetic monster before noon. This little magnetic monster finally stopped electrocuting itself, but once it discharged electricity, the electromagnetic waves it continuously emitted would be disrupted, and it would fall from the sky. Obviously, this was another failure. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the fourth little magnetic monster was created. At 4 in the afternoon, the fifth little magnetic monster died. At 7:30 in the evening, the sixth little magnetic monster, the bronze eye, exploded. This bronze eye, which had been through 6 little magnetic monsters, finally chose to self-destruct, unwilling to accept the humiliation. At 8 in the evening, Dake put on his coat and resolutely took Meow Meow with him. He chose to go out. On the night of December 23rd, Traveler's Street was decorated with lanterns and colored banners. It was very lively. Christmas trees could be seen everywhere with all kinds of colored lights. The faces of passers-by reflected the red and green colors, and they were full of smiles. However, in such a lively festive atmosphere, there was a blond young man with his cat going door to door, looking for a suitable core to be used on a little magnetic monster. Meow. Meow Meow suddenly grabbed a light yellow eyeball and held it up with both hands. The dispirited look on its face disappeared. Dake curiously walked over and saw the two words, Thunder Beast, on the counter where the eyeball was placed. The eyeball of a Thunder Beast? Dake couldn't help but frown. As the name suggested, Thunder Beast was a type of magical beast with a thunder attribute. They varied in size, but most of them were in the shape of a leopard. They had long, lightning-like horns on top of their heads, and could release thunder and lightning from their horns. The most terrifying ability was that they could use their long horns to summon thunder and lightning in stormy weather, guiding the power of nature to kill their opponents. This was how the Thunder Beast got its name. However, the Thunder Beast's eyeball didn't qualify as the core of a golem. Because it was a biological organ, it would rot. Even if it was successfully used to create a high-quality golem, it would be difficult to extend its shelf life. Even if it was sealed in a magic card like the Curse Cage, it wouldn't change this flaw. It's indeed easier to create a golem using biological organs, but unless you can make the golem come to life, or use an extremely difficult alchemy technique to mechanize biological organs, it's just a coincidence. Dake shook his head. He didn't master the alchemy technique to mechanize biological organs. However, in the face of his doubts, Meow Meow shook its head vigorously. Even its dead fish eyes were wide open, and it kept meowing. Dake was silent for a while, and then he nodded. Then, he took out his academy card and bought the Thunder Beast's eyeball. Back in the dormitory, the man and the cat started to create the golem without stopping. Since the Thunder Beast's eyeball could naturally store and release electricity, part of the circuits used in the production of the golem could be abandoned, and the production process was shortened by a lot. At 10:40 p.m., the seventh little magnetic monster was created. It wasn't until the production was completed that Dake finally realized the uniqueness of this Thunder Beast's eyeball. This was a mutated Thunder Beast's eyeball. Not only did it have the thunder attribute, but it had also mutated into the steel attribute. It was a natural core. Believe in Meow Meow. Believe in treasure-gathering technique. Dake held the little magnetic monster in excitement. The Thunder Beast's eye was perfectly fused with the surrounding steel. The little magnetic monster, which was made with the little magnetic monster as its core, had much better control over magic power than the little magnetic monster made with the bronze eye. He couldn't wait to order the little magnetic monster to demonstrate. The horseshoe-shaped magnets on both sides of its body slowly rotated, and its whole body floated under the magnetic force. It was very stable. Discharge. The little magnetic monster's big eyeball suddenly fixed and released a golden electric current, hitting the target accurately. It's finally done. Dake's face lit up with joy, and he immediately tested its intelligence. 10 minutes later, he had an understanding of the little magnetic monster's level. It was roughly between 1.0 and 1.5. Although it still wasn't at the level of a simulacrum level, because the little magnetic monster was a mechanical creation, it was actually very close. If he used this little magnetic monster to hand in his homework, it would definitely be at the level of an excellent, regardless of whether he passed or not. Dake's mind turned, and he took out the third spell cage that he had made in his spare time. Meow, meow, meow. Meow Meow squatted on the table and stared at him excitedly, urging him to do it. In the name of Dake Dim-ing, I summon this spell cage. Dake focused a little and immediately cast the usual summoning spell, sealing the little magnetic monster into the spell cage. Soon, the spell cage in his hand became Spell Cage, Little Magnetic Monster. O, greater than over equal to mouth, O. Chapter 738. Curse Cage was a type of magic card that could temporarily seal demonic spirits, golems, and other simulated life forms into the card and be used as a magic elven card. Generally speaking, it could give demonic spirits offensive abilities, but it did not have any effect on the golems that could fully display their abilities. Therefore, its existence was not very meaningful. Most of the time, it was used as a portable device to carry the golems. However, with the demise of the alchemy profession, there were fewer and fewer people who could make golems. However, the existence of a thing always had its own value. The key was whether someone could dig out its shining point. It was said that among the celebrity duelists, there was an active duelist. Because there were a large number of high-level golems in his house, he was good at using the curse cage to seal them up and use them in magic duels. He was invincible. Of course, that was only a derivation and expansion of the most basic usage of the curse cage. Since ancient times, there was only one person who could really use the curse cage to its full potential. And this person was looking at the curse cage card in his hand with joy. In the card, there was a wooden cage hanging, the word curse flashing, and a round-headed little magnetic monster was floating quietly. This was the first time Dake sealed a golem in a curse cage. Although he had done many conceptions before he really tested it, it was only at the stage of conceptualization. Remember, https://m Vipkanchu. VIP. He looked at the star rating above the card. Thanks to the high grade of the Thunder Beast's eye, the star rating of this little magnetic monster was higher than Curse Cage, Little Devil Monster, and Curse Cage, Sub-Ancient Beast. There were 3 stars depicted on it. Its 3 measurements were typical of high attack and low defense. However, the attack value of the Magic Elven card generally referred to the attack that can be achieved by using the most correct attack method. The little magnetic monster had small arms and legs. It was impossible to expect it to shoot itself out like a cannonball, right? Therefore, its attack basically referred to magic attacks. After Dake looked at it briefly, he immediately injected mana to get further information. Card name, Little Magnetic Monster. Type, Elven card, level, ****, race, machine, attribute, electric/steel, mana, 1000 attack, 1200 defense, 600 ultimate skill, discharge. In order to shorten the production time, Dake did not add too many complicated elements into the little magnetic monster. Therefore, it was understandable that the little magnetic monster only had 1 ultimate skill. However, according to Dake's initial prediction, he thought that this little magnetic monster would have the chance to acquire the 2 ultimate skills, electromagnetic wave and electric shock. Now, although it could release electromagnetic waves to make itself float in the air, it was a pity that it could not form the killing move, electromagnetic waves. And the electric shock that he had originally guessed was upgraded to the even more powerful discharge. The difference in power between discharge and electric shock was a whole fold. Moreover, it had changed from a single target attack to an AoE attack. This was obviously a huge enhancement. That's all right. Dake pondered for a moment and injected more magic power to read the detailed description. Discharge. Little magnetic monster releases a dazzling electric current to attack all targets around it. Sometimes, it can paralyze the target. With a probability of paralyzing effect and a high-intensity AoE attack, discharge was indeed a good ultimate skill. The only problem was that it did not seem to have any direction. This meant that when the little magnetic monster used discharge, it would indiscriminately attack the opponents around it, which was not convenient in practice. However, this little magnetic monster was a golem, not a familiar. It was difficult to change the attributes and ultimate skills of a familiar, but it was different for golems. Changing armor, upgrading circuits, and adding weapons could allow a golem to complete the next step of transformation. The little magnetic monster before him was only a basic model. First, activate intelligence. Dake raised the magic card and summoned it under Meow Meow's unblinking gaze. In the name of Dake Dim-eng, I summon the little magnetic monster. With a flash of electricity, the little magnetic monster, which had not changed at all compared to before, appeared. Then, he took the card bag that the sweet little cotton-padded jacket passed to him with its ribbon tentacles and picked out the only Gluttony, Great Sin card, Gluttony 2. Gluttony corresponded to Venus, and its main attribute was steel, which was a perfect match for the little magnetic monster. However, in fact, using any type of Great Sin card seemed to be able to activate intelligence for the magic fairy. Dake himself did not have a deep understanding of this, so he could only vaguely feel that it was more appropriate to use the corresponding type of Great Sin card to activate intelligence for the magic fairy. Without further ado, under the light of Gluttony 2, the little magnetic monster's big and empty eyes gradually condensed a divine light. The core difference between a mimic golem and a similar golem was the difference in intelligence level. A mimic golem's intelligence level was as high as 2.5, and its logic circuit was not inferior to that of a dog with a higher IQ. It was even smarter than the average magic fairy. It was actually very, very difficult for an alchemist to cross this threshold called intelligence. However, Dake took a different path, or rather, opportunistic, and easily crossed it. When the light of Gluttony 2 faded, the little magnetic monster's intelligence level had jumped by 3 levels, directly surpassing the patrolling golems of the academy and reaching a level that even the magic fairies and magic fairies could not match. Rawr! The moment it activated its intelligence, it suddenly narrowed its eyes, and the 2 horseshoe-shaped magnets spun at high speed, and its body flashed with a golden electric light. In Dake's mind, he suddenly remembered the electrocution that a certain electric rat used on its master, and almost subconsciously retreated. He was not a newbie, and he could not withstand the electric shock. Gluttony 2 made the little magnetic monster's appetite soar, but it fed on electricity, and there was no electricity in the whole room, which only made it restless and restless as it spun around in the air. Fortunately, other than that, it did not do anything else, which was reassuring. Dake lowered his head and looked at the magic card. Great Sins 2 could allow Curse Cage, little evil magical beast, to obtain a new sure kill skill, allow Curse Cage, sub-ancient beast, to evolve into a 3-star subspecies, and allow Fantasy Beast, Ibu, to obtain a field skill. However, it did not have any special strengthening effects on ordinary Pokémon. However, he would only know the specifics after looking at it. As he looked at it, his heart suddenly moved. He found that this Curse Cage, little magnetic monster, did indeed have an additional sure kill skill. Analyze. Little magnetic monster has a strong analytical ability and can independently collect information for analysis. After a complete analysis of the target, it can release a sure kill skill that can increase damage by 0% to 100%. A skill that increases the damage of a sure kill skill. It has a strong analytical ability. Dake raised his head, and his smile gradually brightened. Curse Cage, little magnetic monster, was only a 3-star magic fairy with an attack power of 1,200. Even if the damage was doubled, it was not much. However, having a strong analytical ability was completely different. This meant that this 2-star Curse Cage, little magnetic monster, would be an excellent experimental assistant. Who knows, it might be a little genius. He thought of a certain Pokémon called Tolome. Little magnetic monster, with the sure kill skill Analyze, might be able to be a substitute for Tolome. Of course, this little magnetic monster still needed Gluttony 2 to obtain the sure kill skill Analyze. This sure kill skill that could not be maintained in a normal state had limited meaning. However, this little magnetic monster was a golem. Since Gluttony 2 had already proven that it could obtain the Analyze ability, then as long as little magnetic monster software, hardware, and other aspects were adjusted and upgraded, it would be able to obtain the Analyze ability. It's not a big problem. Dake still had some confidence in his alchemy talent. He then sat back at the table, bent over the table to record, and waited patiently. It was not until 15 minutes later that Curse Cage, little magnetic monster, recovered from the effects of gluttony, and no longer ran around like a headless fly. Dake habitually checked its magic card again to confirm the changes in the value. Then he suddenly realized that the Analyze in the Sure Kill skill column was still there. A moment later, he was pleasantly surprised to realize that this Analyze should have been generated after Little Magnetic Monster's spiritual intelligence was activated. It had nothing to do with gluttony too. Perfect. Dake immediately summoned Little Magnetic Monster to his side and tested its intelligence with meow meow. Then, he quickly confirmed that this Little Magnetic Monster's ability to receive and analyze information was extremely strong. Although it was not as good as a computer for the time being, it already had the appearance of a normal computer when calculating addition and subtraction. As for why it only had addition and subtraction instead of multiplication and division, of course, it was because it had not mastered it yet. However, to be able to master addition and subtraction within 10 minutes after it was born, it was obviously extremely terrifying. This Little Magnetic Monster's future was limitless. Dake held it in his palm and stared at it, but there were already more associations in his mind. He did not expect to create more Little Magnetic Monsters with spiritual intelligence. After all, it had been verified before that the same type of magic fairy he had could only activate one spiritual intelligence. However, what if this Little Magnetic Monster could use electromagnetic waves to control other Little Magnetic Monsters? If he used multiple Little Magnetic Monsters to build a specific circuit, would it be able to increase its analysis and calculation ability? Using this method, would it be able to accumulate a super high calculation ability like the clones of Beep 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 Beep? After all, there was a limit to human strength. Dake still had some understanding of his own intelligence. He knew that he was smarter than the average person. In short, he was not that smart. He could not be compared to those famous geniuses with high intelligence in history. However, what if he could build a super brain? Thinking of this, Dake looked at Little Magnetic Monster with a burning gaze. After a while, he placed Little Magnetic Monster on the table. In his mind, he was already thinking about how to upgrade its hardware. In the process of creating this magic golem, he had actually come up with many ideas. Among them, the most basic ideas could not be two. One was to upgrade the basic hardware of Little Magnetic Monster so that it could obtain stronger magic, attack, and defense. The second was to upgrade the internal circuit of Little Magnetic Monster so that it could obtain stronger discharge abilities. The first type was actually easier to improve, but it required higher quality materials. Although the second was more difficult, it was only possible after reaching a certain bottleneck. With Little Magnetic Monster's current level, Dake still had the ability to upgrade it further. If he temporarily put the idea of upgrading the magic golem aside and changed it to upgrading the Pokémon, there was also a very obvious path. The next evolution of Little Magnetic Monster was called 3-in-1 Magnetic Monster. As the name suggested, it was a Pokémon born after 3 Little Magnetic Monsters were combined into one. Therefore, according to this idea, he needed to create 2 more Little Magnetic Monsters to conduct experiments. At the same time, he could use this to verify the feasibility of the Super Brain Plan. However, the problem with this path was that it was not easy to find a Thunder Beast's Eye that could mutate the Steel attribute. Therefore, not to mention creating 2 more Little Magnetic Monsters, even creating 1 more Little Magnetic Monster would be very difficult. Let's go to Traveler's Street tomorrow. If I really can't find a Thunder Beast's Eye with the Steel attribute, then I can only think of a way to change it to a less rare core. Dake shook his head and prepared to strike while the iron was hot. He would start by upgrading the internal circuit. However, just as he was about to do it, the devil that corrupted the will of men came. On the last night before the Christmas ball, Aurora, who still had not been able to hand over her invitation to the ball, came again with freshly made turtle soup. Dake drank a bowl of turtle soup and could not help but think of the garlic turtle. Oh, the garlic turtle. He had always had a faint obsession with the first generation of Pokémon, Charmander, Wonderful Frog, and Jenny Turtle, as well as the fourth of the three, Pikachu. He had always wanted to create them, but unfortunately, he had not been able to fulfill his dream. After calming down, Dake chatted with Aurora about the Freedom City. As they chatted, Aurora was sent out of the door again. Aurora, who returned to the dormitory with an empty tray, looked at the invitation to the ball in her hand with an indifferent expression. Dake Dim-Eng, on the other hand, had already started his little magnetic monster upgrade. It was not until night time that he finally succeeded in upgrading. Refresh later. Dake Dim-Eng, on the other hand, had already started his little magnetic monster upgrade. It was not until night time that he finally succeeded in upgrading. Dake Dim-Eng, on the other hand, had already started his little magnetic monster upgrade. It was not until night time that he finally succeeded in upgrading. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.